Working, that's good. Good afternoon again and welcome to GW. My name is David Darling and I'm the Dean of the School of Engineering and Applied Science here at the George Washington University. I don't think it would be news to anybody that there's been a lot of documents out there recently with respect to cybersecurity. We've seen the White House's executive order aimed at protecting our critical infrastructure. We've seen a report from the security company Mandiant that exposed a Chinese military hacking group. And very much in the news now, although it's faded after the press conference yesterday afternoon, have been documents related to NSA's PRISM and telephone surveillance programs. Well, today we're very fortunate to have several experts with us to discuss their various viewpoints on surveillance, on cybersecurity and the future of the internet. As we try to be secure while protecting privacy, we do need to be guided by knowledge from many disciplines. And in fact, this was stated quite explicitly last December at the launch of the GW Cybersecurity Initiative. The initiative's chairman, former DHS Secretary Michael Chertoff, spoke of the need for universities like ours and others to give students an understanding of the triad of technology, business, policy, and how they interact to create difficult cybersecurity challenges. While I'm on the podium here, I'd like to just take advantage of a captive audience, because I know you're all too polite to jeer or get up and move out, to say a few things about the School of Engineering and Applied Science here at GW, which is a very thriving, growing enterprise. Our Department of Computer Science, in fact, anticipated Secretary Chertoff's remarks by launching last fall a Master of Science in Cybersecurity in our Computer Science Department. It's the first program in Washington, DC, designed specifically to respond to the large and fast-growing need for technical cybersecurity experts locally, nationally, and internationally. Underscoring our commitment here to cybersecurity education and public service are our NSF and DHS-sponsored CyberCore scholarship programs. These programs fund students who are going to be future leaders in the federal government on cybersecurity, and indeed, some of them already are. Each week, the CyberCore students meet in class, often with current or former federal employees, as well as industry experts, to learn about the major cybersecurity issues so they're prepared to meet the challenges that will certainly greet them after they graduate here and take jobs. This course, which was previously only available to CyberCore students, is now available to all GW students as a hybrid course conducted mostly online with a short, intensive in-person learning experience at the beginning. Starting next year, some doctoral students in the Graduate School of Education and Human Development here at GW on human and organizational learning will also be taking this class as a required part of their cybersecurity focus. Well, let me say that today's event, which looks to be very well populated and looks like it's going to be very interesting, is sponsored by the Cybersecurity Policy and Research Institute, we abbreviate that around here to CISPRI, of the School of Engineering and Applied Science. In addition to overseeing the CyberCore program, it facilitates and executes interdisciplinary research in education in cybersecurity across GW. One example of this is its work with the Graduate School of Education and Human Development, supporting the National Cyberwatch Center in a joint project to develop the nation's cybersecurity workforce. More information on that program, on CISPRI, on cybersecurity scholarships, and School of Engineering and Applied Science can be found in the material available at the registration desk. We're happy to have as a co-sponsor of this event today the Internet Society, and it's my pleasure to now introduce Paul Brigner, Regional Director of the North American Bureau at the Internet Society, to come up and tell you a few words about it and its role in today's event. So on behalf of GW, the School of Engineering and Applied Science, CISPRI, and the Department of Computer Science, welcome to GW, and I hope you have a great afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Dulling, and thank you to the George Washington Cybersecurity Policy and Research Institute for partnering with us on this event today. And thanks to all of you for joining us. And that means not everyone here in the room, but also to those who are at a remote hub in New York City. That remote hub is being sponsored by the Internet Society's New York chapter. I know we don't have a good view of them with the camera right now, but what's going to happen is they will walk up to that camera and ask questions. And by the way, they've been meeting on this topic already this morning. They've had their own meetings today, so maybe that gives you an idea of how passionate that group of individuals is about the topics we will be discussing. So thank you to the New York chapter for getting together to join us as a remote hub. And definitely thank you to all those on live stream. We have a very good crowd already gathering on live stream to watch us from all over the world. My first order of business here today is to make sure that you're aware of the Internet Society if this is the first time you're joining for one of our events. We are a global nonprofit cause-driven organization with a very straightforward vision. That is, the Internet is for everyone. We work to achieve that vision by promoting the open development, evolution, and use of the Internet for the benefit of all people throughout the world. Some of our key functions involve facilitating the open development of standards, protocols, administration, and the technical infrastructure of the Internet, supporting Internet education in developing countries, promoting professional development and community building to foster greater participation and leadership in areas important to the evolution of the Internet, and fostering an environment for international cooperation, community, and a culture that enables Internet self-governance. While ISOC staff leads specific projects on these topics, much of our work is achieved through the work of our members and chapters around the world. And speaking of chapters, I would like to give special recognition to the local DC chapter. I am very fortunate that our headquarters is just not far away in Reston, Virginia, so I'm able to interact personally with our DC chapter on a regular basis. And I can attest to the fact that they're really a first-class group of people that regularly hold very interesting meetings related to the Internet Society's mission. So if you're local and you're not involved, you're really missing out. I do hope you will get involved. And if the leaders who are here from the Internet Society DC chapter would stand briefly, I just want to make sure that you're recognized. So great. So you know who they are. Please make a special effort to talk to them today during this event if you'd like to get involved with the chapter. One of my key functions at the Internet Society is to work closely with our chapters in the region, not only to plan INET events like this, but to assist with their events and to have an open dialogue on policy issues. That dialogue, in turn, helps me and my colleagues at the Internet Society to form our policy positions and help to set the agenda for our regional meetings like the one we're attending today. And that brings me to today's agenda. The topic of this INET has really been driven by the interest of our members in the North American region and around the world. It so happens today that one of our panelists is the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Internet Society, that's Lynn St. Amour. So she will have the opportunity to address the concerns of our constituency today. Now, without further delay, I would like to introduce Professor Lance Hoffman. He's the director of the Cybersecurity Policy and Research Institute here at George Washington University. I first met Professor Hoffman when he sponsored a debate on PIPA and SOPA, and I knew that he was, based on that experience, I knew that he was game to talk about some very controversial topics, so I guessed right. He was interested in talking about this one as well, and it's been really a pleasure to partner with him on this event. So I want to sincerely thank you for that. It's really been a great experience. I'd also like to thank all of our fantastic panelists who have agreed to speak here today. We really have an all-star group of people who are taking their time out to share their views with you. I'd like them all to come up and take their seats on stage now, if they would, and I will turn this event over to Professor Hoffman. One thing I forgot to mention is that if you want to Twitter or tweet about this event, please use the hashtag INETDC. INETDC. Thank you all very much.
Good afternoon, everybody. Let me add my welcome to that of Dean Darling and to Paul Brigner. And let me also thank the Internet Society, our co-sponsor for this event, for their programmatic and financial assistance in making it possible. I also want to thank from CSPRI my Associate Director, Dr. Kostas Teregas, and our interns and research assistants who have worked on this and are helping here today, Trey Hare, Dustin Vandenberg, Jamie Moore, and Greg Ziegler. My role today is to set the stage for our excellent panel and then to moderate that panel discussion on cybersecurity and the future of the Internet, given the recent revelations about PRISM and other surveillance programs. The panelists have each agreed to summarize their thoughts in a 4-minute statement so that we can have lots of time for questions from the audience, including the audience in cyberspace. After the audience question and answer session and a short break, participants will return for a very interesting session, a roundtable discussion where we will see their worldviews on this, where their worldviews agree and where there are tensions, and talk about these in a roundtable which will be informed by their previous statements and the audience questions beforehand. I'm delighted that for this event, we will have an experienced moderator, Professor Steve Roberts, leading the roundtable discussion. Many of the students and faculty here may recognize Steve as the Shapiro Professor of Media and Public Affairs here at GW, but others, including those viewing this on the internet, may be more familiar with him from his appearances as a commentator on many Washington-based television shows, as a political analyst on the ABC radio network, and as a substitute host on NPR's Diane Rehm show, another role where he elicits material from experts and clarifies it to facilitate informed public discussion. But before the roundtable, let me identify the participants on stage. We will not have lengthy introductions here since their bio sketches have been made available to you in the brochure, which you have gotten or can get at the registration desk. But anyway, let me introduce very briefly, and you see their name tags in front of you. Danny Weitzner is the director and co-founder of the MIT Computer Science and Artificial Intelligence Laboratory.
Not the whole lab.
Not the whole lab? Oh.
I'll explain.
Okay. Lynn St. Amour is the president and CEO of the Internet Society. Let's see, who's next? Laura DeNardis is professor, School of Communication at American University. Melissa Hathaway is president of Hathaway Global Strategies. Let's see, who's down there? I don't have you on my list.
Oh, no.
I apologize.
That would be me.
Oh, Randy, of course. Randy from, why don't I have him here? Anyway, okay, where are you from? I'll let you introduce yourself, I'm sorry.
I'm the University IT Security Officer at Virginia Tech.
I didn't want to get it wrong and say some wrong university. Sorry, Randy. Okay, let's see. Leslie Harris is from Center for Democracy and Technology. And last but not least, John Curran, President and CEO of American Registry for Internet Numbers. Okay, so without further ado, I am going to suggest we each go down the, I have to decide, I'm going to leave it to, I guess, either Danny or John on who wants to go first.
No, go ahead.
Oh, okay.
Okay, John, you're on. 4 minutes,
thank
please.
you. I'm happy to be here, and want to thank the opportunity to present at this panel. Keeping my remarks short, I will say that we're in an interesting period of time with respect to the future of the internet and how it's governed. People may not realize it, but the fact is there's a coordination function that's existed since the earliest days of the internet, which is necessary so that we can actually use the internet, so that it actually functions. For example, computers on the internet have unique identifiers, several actually. One of them is the IP addresses, which is part of what Aaron is involved in. We can't have computers using the same IP addresses. Every computer needs its own IP address. Likewise, there's coordination of things like domain names to make sure that a domain name is assigned to one organization, et cetera, et cetera. This is called technical coordination, and it's been a function of the internet, necessary function for the protocols to work as designed since the very beginning. people may not realize that this used to all be done by one gentleman, Dr. John Postel, who we no longer have with us, but was an amazing individual. And in the late 90s, we actually went about setting up infrastructure to enable this technical coordination so that IP addresses and domain names could be available to everyone globally for their use on the internet, but coordinated so that they actually interoperated, so that they worked as expected. This structure involves a lot of organizations. ARIN is one. There's 5 regional registries throughout the globe. ARIN is the one that handles North America, so Canada, the United States, and about half of the Caribbean. But there are 4 other regional registries. And then there's the DNS coordination that goes on through organizations such as ICANN, the International Organization for Assigned Names and Numbers. So the fact is that these bodies all work doing technical coordination that's very important. But they've been doing it based on a historical trajectory, a trajectory that originated with projects and programs out of the US government, which have since been increasingly moved out to independence, but we're not quite there yet. In fact, some of you may be aware that these organizations work under supervision, somewhat indirect, but still supervision, of programs such as NTIA in the Department of Commerce. And so one of the things that we now find ourselves facing is that there's a unique role in the US government with respect to the internet. And this unique role is one that is based on its experience, its steady hand behind the scenes, helping the internet mature and grow. Recently, however, we've now seen that there's another hand that may be busy doing other things, such as surveillance and cybersecurity. And so the question that comes up is, how do we reconcile those? How do we reconcile an open, global, transparent internet run for everyone with the possibility that there is also surveillance going on and other things that may not meet the expectations of global internet users? And so this is the challenge in front of us. It's particularly highlighted because of the fact of the US government's unique oversight role in this. And it's brought to the forefront by the recent discussions where we now see that it is not simply for the benefit of all the internet, but there's also some national priorities and national initiatives that the US government also pursues over the same infrastructure. I think that's a challenge that we will now face more so than ever in light of the revelations of the last few months, and the net result will be a lot of discussion in forums such as this. Thank you.
Thank you, and I'll try to make this iPhone behave a little better.
Okay.
Although
I thought I was over on time.
you were right on time. You were
Okay.
great. Leslie?
So I also want to get us out of the DC bubble and the focus on the rights of people in the United States. I've been talking about that for the last 6 weeks. And Congress is about to consider an amendment that's going to rein in the NSA's ability to collect our metadata from phones. I want to pivot away from that because I think there's 3 other things that we ought to be considering at least. What the reactions of governments and internet users around the world and what this means for the architecture, not just the governance, the architecture of the internet, and also for the protection of human rights of global internet users. And that turns out to be a very thorny question. Certainly for governments, I think this entire kerfuffle has reinforced the concerns that the global internet has undermined their sovereignty and control over their citizens. And it's further illuminated this sort of privileged position of the United States, certainly with respect to ICANN and some of the other critical resources. We continue to have a disproportionate share of internet traffic, all that's declining, and obviously we have a dominance in our global internet companies. For some, and the EU is, I think, a good example, this illuminates an inability to protect the human rights of their own citizens, and we have a major fight coming up in the data directive there about whether they're going to allow data to come to the United States at all. At the same time, this is an extraordinary opportunity for authoritarian governments to exert more control over the people and data in their own borders. And it's, you know, Russia's now dusting off a legislation that has to do with national servers. You're going to see that elsewhere as well. And I think it's fair to worry whether this carefully honed narrative, as a U.S. narrative of the wise, trusted, neutral steward of the internet, can really hold. And it's fair to ask whether we're moving towards a balkanization of the internet as governments seize this moment to impose local server requirements, or worse, and we saw some of these proposals last year. I know we're supposed to be acronym-free at the Wicket, I'll explain. Routing requirements to either avoid the United States or literally to direct the routing of traffic. And the worst outcome being literally ring-fenced national or regional networks. If I were in Latin America and noticed that there was 80% of my traffic still coming from the United States, I may start to wonder why we're still relying on Miami to reach most of the world. Some of that might be a weird salutary effect, that we finally get internet exchange points in some places that have not had them. But I think governments becoming involved directly in the routing of internet data would pose a profound challenge to the open end-to-end internet, and I think all these things are going to be on the table. I think you also can expect to see a re-examination of the world's relationships with our cloud providers. You're already seeing that. You know, there's a Netherlands provider, no PRISM, no surveillance, no government backdoors. And finally, I think we may have lost some of the rapprochement that happened in the governance wars in the last year. There are a number of important forums and discussions coming up about various treaties and how much various treaty bodies ought to be able to impose themselves into internet debates. I think we're going to lose some ground there, and it could be, I think, quite troubling. Last point, global internet users are furious. They believe their human rights have been violated, and I think they don't yet realize that it's not entirely clear whether they have any recourse for that. There's a lot of ambiguity in human rights law. Human rights law pretty much applies. Countries make commitments to protect the human rights of people within their borders or their control. I don't think we've begun to understand or have any clarity on who's responsible for human rights when there's non-physical actions such as electronic surveillance. And they're not going to be happy when they understand that FISA and all the conversations in the United States about safeguards and minimization are to protect our rights but have absolutely nothing to do with them. I don't think Congress is going to care, but I think there's a massive loss of respect, and when we're talking about 5 zettabytes, whatever that is, of non-US person data going into a new Utah data center, I think that the irony at the end of the day will be that one of the FISA permissible activities is collecting intelligence for foreign affairs and foreign policy. And I think at the end of the day, we may see people of the world uniting with their governments around kinds of restrictions and ring fencing of the internet that will come to both undermine rights and undermine the openness of the internet. So that is my anxious person's guide to to what's been happening.
Thank you, Leslie. Randy?
How many of you counted how many surveillance devices you've passed to get to this room? Yeah? I just walking from the restaurant a couple blocks away, I counted 22 surveillance-style devices just in the walk outside of this building, and there's at least 6 in this room right now, that not counting your smartphones and all that. I hope you all can find the 6, because they're pretty obvious as to what they are. My point on all of this is that as a practitioner, I'm the CISO for Virginia Tech. My office is responsible for monitoring and responding to any attacks against our network infrastructure at Virginia Tech. We have our main campus down in Blacksburg, Virginia. It's about 4.5 hours from here. We have a Northern Virginia campus right across the river in Ballston. And my office is charged to monitor any attacks from there. Anybody who has ever managed an internet infrastructure has known since the very beginning that the internet has never been anonymous in the sense of tracking a machine. From day one, We've always been able to track where a machine was. We were not able to track who was at the machine with any reasonable amount of accuracy, but we've always been able to track where machines are. The big thing was, of course, data, storage capabilities. We didn't have enough data storage capabilities, disk drives. In 1992, when I got involved, first involved with computer security stuff, you know, we had a 1 gigabyte drive, and we thought that was, you know, the entire disk storage in the entire free world. And you know, nowadays with the huge disk farms that are out there, that is allowing this collection of data. So from our standpoint, that's always been the case. So my challenge is, you all let this happen. You all knew that this was happening, and you let it go on. There was nothing new about the PRISM stuff and all of this. It's kind of ironic for people in my world, because we all sit back and we go, you know, in 2010, the Washington Post, Dana Priest and William Arkin wrote an excellent series called Top Secret America, where they're talking about all of the Beltway bandit companies that are building the surveillance technologies that the federal government and other entities are using. All out there. It was an excellent series in the newspaper. I read it back then. Newsweek came out in 2008, where they talked about a whistleblower who mentioned about NSA's warrantless wiretapping, so to speak. It was all out there. If you go back and you look through the press things, there was always something there, and nobody reacted to it. So it's ironic from my viewpoint that everybody is having this big flap about it now, because it's been there, and you let it happen. So my charge to you is, don't let it happen again. Okay? When you do read about these things, you need to influence your legislators about what's going on, because they do not understand the technology. One quick example. In Virginia, there's data breach notification laws if Social Security is disclosed. You know, somebody gets a spreadsheet and it's exposed out there. Yet I can go to a county courthouse website and look up public records, deeds, divorce decrees, whatever, and what's on those documents. Yet the county clerks can't redact that information because until recently, the law forbade it. Okay, everybody was in a rush for e-government, but nobody thought about what's in those documents that's going there. So we need to be able to influence and educate the legislators who are building the policy. So this is the whole thing. I'm a technologist, and everybody in here, the computer scientists and all that, y'all are in here with me. We helped build this infrastructure. We may have had a misgiving where we thought that as builders we could control the people who use it. But as you know, previous history shown with the atom bomb development and all these other things, that's not always the case. Builders do not control the controllers. That's my first point. The second point is that, again, you all have smartphones. Actually, I don't. I have kind of a dumb phone. And people always laugh. They go, well, you know, you're a technologist, and I just have a little, you know, Samsung Integrity with the nice little flippy thing. And I say it's because the guys in my lab have busted into smartphones and tracked everybody all over the place. But actually, the reason why I don't do it is because battery life is not long enough for my taste, okay? But a great quote. Lynn Paramore wrote a great article, and in there quoted things that are supposed to make our lives easier. Smartphones, Gmail, Skype, GPS, Facebook, they have become tools to track us. And we've been happily shopping for the bars to our own prison, one prison at a time, one product at a time. So we're to blame for all of this. We are allowing that to happen. The last thing I want to talk about is this federal wordplay thing. Whenever I confront a student or a professor who's been violating a university policy, you let something go out on the net. And I go, why'd you do that? And it's kind of like watching, you know, a 6-year-old. I don't know, you know, it wasn't my fault, you know, that type of stuff. You get this wordplay. Richard Pryor, a long time ago, had an excellent thing when his son broke something, and he asked his son what happened, and all the wordplay that his son came out with, you know, some invisible man came out and broke the thing. That's what we're seeing now. We're seeing this when they say, we're not collecting data on you. Well, okay, you're not collecting it technically, but you're buying it from people who are collecting it from us, for us. So that's one thing there. The network companies that say, you know, the data providers, the Verizons, the Googles, they say, hey, you know, we're not willingly giving it to the federal government. Well, of course not. You're being subpoenaed for the document. You're not giving it willingly to there. You know, Zach Holman wrote a great little tweet. says, we don't give direct database access to government agencies. That quote has become the new I didn't inhale. Okay? And so the key word is direct. Marketers have been collecting information on us all the time. And in fact, that was one of the big things that helped us with 9/11. On a positive side, that did help us in 9/11 identify the hijackers when the marketing companies and the credit card companies realized that they could help because they had that data. So we need to be sure that things are done correctly. Everybody says we're doing it legally, and that's correct. The laws states that they can do it. It's the creation of that law that's the flaw. And that's my surveillance guy telling me it's time to quit. Those are my points.
Thanks, Randy. Melissa?
Thank you. Well, I think it's important to look to our past to inform our future, and I'm going to take a little bit different direction than my colleagues. The very first transmission of the internet was October 29th, 1969, and it was an email between two universities. And today we have more than 204 emails are sent per minute. More than 1,300 new mobile users are added per minute to the internet. 47,000 applications are downloaded, 100,000 tweets, 1.3 million videos are uploaded to YouTube, 2 million searches to Google, and 6 million Facebook views. The internet is part of every part of our life. And over the last 45 almost years, we have embedded the internet in every part of our society, and it is the backbone of our core infrastructure, of every country's core infrastructure. It represents e-government, e-banking, e-health, e-learning, the next generation of air traffic control, the next generation of power grids, and every other essential service has been concentrated onto one infrastructure, the internet. And that is putting our businesses and our national security at risk. And when I speak about I'm really speaking it as a global citizen. If I were in France, I would be speaking about it in France. If I were in Iran or Israel, it's the same way. And so I think that has really begun to change the conversation, that we can't have any one single point of failure, economic failure and or national security failure to any one of our core businesses or infrastructures. And so when we're talking about cybersecurity and we're talking about different government actions and we wrap it all into one conversation, I ask you to start to think about it as multiple conversations. And it's not helpful to bundle it into one term of cybersecurity and or surveillance. So I'd like you to think about it in 6 different ways of why our governments and why our industry are talking past each other. The first is when we're talking about cybersecurity, we're sometimes talking about political activism. Those who would like to bring transparency to policies and or initiatives that they don't agree with. In the United States, one could say that was WikiLeaks that brought about a great amount of transparency to U.S. policies as they leaked our information into the internet. One could argue that was also Snowden. But in other countries, political activism is being used by using Twitter and or Facebook to organize people in the squares like Taksim or in Turkey or Egypt to express political discontent with their government with the intent to overthrow the government, political instability. And so when our governments are starting to talk about surveillance on the internet and or filtering of the internet, some believe in political democracy and freedom of that speech on the internet, and others do not. And it has different mechanisms of how they're using that surveillance or the technology around political activism. Now that should not be confused with organized crime on the internet. The real modern day bank robber who's stealing ones and zeros, which is real dollars, out of your credit card accounts or out of your real banks, and is being passed on as a cost to our citizens. We have many of our governments are talking about the importance of organized crime. When I was just in Europe just a few weeks ago, it was $30 million stolen out of 45 different cities in 30 minutes. That's a real problem for our banks. It's a real problem for our credit cards. And we're having to deal with that organized crime and real theft of ones and zeros. Now that should not be confused with intellectual property theft and industrial espionage. That's very different. And many of our government leaders in the United States and many government leaders in Europe are talking about the unprecedented theft of intellectual property, theft meaning illegally copying the plans, processes, and or next generation technologies out of our corporations for the economic advance of their companies and or countries. And so the intellectual property theft is then not the same as espionage. And there are governments that are conducting espionage, most governments do, to steal the plans and intentions of other governments and know their capabilities. In the United States, we've sort of bundled the two, IP theft and espionage, when we're talking about it. In fact, we're talking about it as Pearl Harbor and other very exaggerated terms. If we're going to bundle intellectual property theft with espionage, then we have to be willing to put espionage that we would walk away from it as a government. And I don't see any government willing to walk away from espionage. So why don't we talk about what's really the problem, and that's intellectual property theft and or the protection of intellectual property and patents, et cetera. There are two other areas that are becoming more concerning for most companies and countries that are, the first is disruption of service, and this is the distributed denial of service that's actually degrading real services in your e-banking and your e-infrastructures that are preventing our banks from allowing you to actually access those infrastructures and or capabilities. And we've just had in the United States, we're having a distributed denial of service against our financial institutions, and so are many others in Asia and Europe. And then finally, the destruction of property. There was just recently malware that was released against Saudi Aramco, which destroyed 30,000 of their computers. And when we start to actually think about destruction of property and how one might recover from that, that is a different set of capabilities than you would deal with from organized crime and or political activism. So as we talk about this on our panel over the course of the next hour, I asked you to start to think about which problem are you talking about, because we're not talking about the same thing in each of our conversations. I'd like to wrap up in that over 100 countries have these capabilities, and they're using these capabilities to deal with these different problems. Whether it's political activism to overthrow my government, or it's political activism to bring transparency to policies I don't like, is different than organized crime or intellectual property theft. And there are three strategic things that are happening in the global order of things. First, some are using disruptive technology, like a Stuxnet or a Shamoon, to bring down core infrastructures or core businesses around the world, or some are implementing surveillance tools to bring about transparency or to show the vulnerabilities for those infrastructures to be brought down. So disruptive technologies are being used. Second, strategic alliances are also being wielded to actually gather that power and control over the internet. And that's playing out in the UN and the ITU and NATO and ASEAN and other of the forum where countries can align against each other for particular motives. And then finally, there are strategic properties. And I mean that in the very sense that it is. There are 25 internet service providers that control 90% of the information flow on the internet. There are internet exchange points that actually control the flow of technology or ones and zeros from continent to continent or within a continent. And there are data aggregators who have actually more information on us, like a Google or a Facebook, than any foreign intelligence service of any other country. So you have to think about where are the strategic properties and how they're being used by all governments, not just by one government. Thank you.
Thank you, Melissa. Laura?
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very delighted to be here, and I wish to thank the Internet Society for the invitation and for GW for hosting it as well. I view PRISM as an opportunity to draw attention to the implications of broader global Internet governance conflicts that have implications for economic and expressive liberty. I recently, the last 2 or 3 years, spent that time researching and writing a new book called The Global War for Internet Governance. And it's going to be published later this year by Yale University Press. Now, in this book, there are approximately 4 pages at the end of acronyms. So what I've done is I've challenged myself today to not use any acronyms. So what I would like to ask you to do is to pound on the table if I use an internet governance acronym. So pay attention to that. And I know some of you will do that. But what I try to do in the book is describe the various layers of how the internet is already governed and what some of the current debates are that I expect to shape the future of freedom and innovation in the coming years. Now, what is internet governance? This panel has already described it. If I had to give one definition, I would say internet governance is the design and administration of the technologies that are necessary to keep the internet operational, and then the enactment of substantive policy around those technologies. But there is no single system of internet governance. John said it best when he was describing the various roles: names and numbers administration, standard setting, private interconnection arrangements between telecommunication companies, the privacy policies that are enacted by social media, by search engines, and other information intermediaries. And of course, cybersecurity governance, not necessarily enacted by governments, but by entities such as certificate authorities that are handing out digital signatures and things like that. So those are just a few examples. So we need to take this conversation outside of discussions about just governments. However, one of the themes that I do take up in the book and in my work in general is that internet governance conflicts are the new spaces where political and economic power is working itself out in the 21st century. We see this with PRISM, we see this with Stuxnet, we see this with the turn to infrastructure for intellectual property rights enforcement, with governments cutting off access during political turmoil, and as Melissa said, with denial of service attacks often used to suppress human rights and expression. So internet governance points of control are really not just about keeping the internet operational, although that is absolutely vital, but they're also a proxy for broader political and economic conflicts. So the fact that PRISM draws attention to some of these broader global internet governance issues is an opportunity. But keep in mind that government surveillance and censorship, for that matter, which is, in my opinion, an even greater problem around the world, is not something that happens in a vacuum. So it's delegated, and it is made possible by certain arrangements of technical architecture and by private ordering. So infrastructure governance, just to give you a few examples, infrastructure governance is directly tied to privacy issues. So I have an information engineering background. I'm also a social scientist who studies the politics of technical architecture. And I can say that you probably could say, to use a Harry Potter analogy, there are some dark arts of internet governance that have a good intention, but they can be used for other uses. So one of these, for example, is deep packet inspection. I didn't use the acronym, so no pounding on the table, which is a capability that allows network providers to inspect the actual content of packets sent over the internet rather than just the packet headers. So this can be used for a variety of very important functions, such as network management, detecting viruses and worms. It could also be used for customized advertising, now getting outside of the operational role, or for surveillance, or for throttling and blocking of traffic. So this is a very significant development, made possible only by advances in processing power and storage. And we need transparency and accountability in issues like this as well. So another area of infrastructure related to privacy is the hidden identity infrastructure that makes possible business models that are based on online advertising. So this is a good thing for freedom of expression because there are free products that we are able to use, but we're almost at the point where the prospect for anonymous speech, considering this identity infrastructure, is almost impossible. We have technical identifiers at the level of hardware, like Ethernet cards, at the level of virtual identifiers, locationally via cell phone location, wireless fidelity, AKA Wi-Fi, it's my one acronym, or global positioning system, and through things like platform mediation and real identification requirements. So if you put this all together, this is at the heart of business models that we need, at the heart of online advertising, at the heart of having free software, but it also is the technical capability that can enable even newer forms of surveillance in the future. So these are new opportunities for surveillance. Two other infrastructure issues I'll mention quickly include a current rethinking and redesign of the WHOIS protocol, which keeps track of who's registering a domain name. And of course, also the issue, as has already been mentioned, of internet exchange points. How these are governed and how they are distributed around the world is something that is very related to civil liberties. The Internet Society, we'll hear from next, has really been at the forefront of this area, having more internet exchange points, looking at the criticality of them for human rights, for infrastructure development, and as concentrated points of information flows. So the truth is that global internet choke points, of course, exist, and the internet is governed not by any one entity, but by multi-stakeholder governance, which I'm sure we will take up in the roundtable later. But that this governance is not fixed any more than architecture is fixed. So the architecture is constantly changing, and the governance is constantly changing as well. The basic theoretical or conceptual framework of my own work is that arrangements of technical architecture are also arrangements of power. So it's critical for the public to be engaged in these debates because the future of internet architecture and governance is directly related to the future of internet freedom. So I appreciate the opportunity to discuss that here today. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Laura. Lynn?
Good afternoon. This has been a very comprehensive set of speaking points, I have to say, to date. So the Internet Society is a cause-based organization. We advocate for an open global internet. And the recent revelations about the mass-scale interceptions, not only by the US, the UK, but many, many other countries around the world, have serious implications for the open global internet. ISOC's an international organization. We have members, org members, and chapters in virtually every country of the world, perhaps even every country of the world. We have headquarters in just outside of DC here in Reston, Virginia, and Geneva, Switzerland, and we have very senior policy and technical staff in a little over 20 countries of the world, oftentimes in the same individual, which is more and more the future in any case. I've spent 27 years in Europe, just moved back to the US a little over a year ago. And the one thing I'd really like to do is to make sure that here in DC, in this country's capital, that we recognize that this is not just about US citizens, and it's not just about the foreigners that the US is surveilling. This affects every individual in the world. It affects some of them very directly, but it will affect the internet we all have access to going forward, to tomorrow and to generations to come. If we're not careful, we will actually rob both individuals today, tomorrow, and future generations of all the freedom and the benefit and the innovation that the internet has brought. The Internet Society actually deals an awful lot in principles, and the principles that make the internet what the internet is. First and foremost, it's a platform. It allows everybody to go out and develop what they choose to access what they choose to innovate on material that's out there and make that available. If we're not careful, we'll lose all of that. So the, in particular, recently, the unwarranted collection, storage, and the ease of correlation amongst all the data that's collected. And I actually don't differentiate a lot between metadata and content. You can get so much information from metadata that we shouldn't kid ourselves by saying it's just metadata we're collecting, it's okay. That though the collection that will undermine many of the key principles in relationships. And in particular, some of those natural conclusions will start to impact the physical infrastructure of the internet itself, whether it's using some of the IXPs as choke points or whether it's using some of the technical capabilities that exist to help with surveillance. Those are all things we want to, I think through very, very carefully. One of the principles we argue for is multi-stakeholder dialogue. And it's because so much of what we're all facing, whether it's in a policy or a technical or a social environment, has never been done in the world before. We're breaking barriers every single day, and we need to bring everybody to the table for a discussion and move forward thoughtfully and carefully. That is even more so when we look to governments, particularly in their role in protecting citizens. We believe that the internet must be a channel for secure, reliable, private communication between entities and individuals. And surveillance without due process is simply unacceptable. And as some other articles have said recently, frankly, it's very creepy as well. If that makes it more personal, this is good, because we need everybody to care about what's happening now. We also challenge the view that policies to ensure security must always come at the cost of users' rights. I'd also argue with the fact that we all knew it was coming, so what are we concerned about? Due process wasn't followed. That's what we're concerned about. Did most people that pay attention to this field understand that you could do all these sorts of things with the data? Yes. Did we believe our governments were doing it without due process, and certainly without an adequate level of transparency? I might answer yes, but hopefully, hopefully we didn't, and allow that to happen, as Frank said. One of the things we'd actually like to do is really get everybody to focus on the multi-stakeholder. A lot of the principles that have given us the internet. Find new forums, structures, and processes to address that. Don't revert back to we need a new institution. I don't think that is the answer in almost every situation. Some of the recent proposals that have been put forward to address some of these aspects would call for treaties. Treaties are largely intergovernmental. They don't allow for the private sector. They don't allow for civil society. And honestly, I don't know how you get some of those private sector companies to sign on to a treaty. So I don't think treaties are the answer either. We're going to need to create new processes and new forums. And certainly at the core of all that ought to be thoughtful, informed dialogue. So I think it's our hope that as these discussions continue across the world, that we recognize and come to agree, again, on some other high-level principles. Some of the ones I'd throw out for further debate is that unwanted surveillance, even in the furtherance of national security, is not acceptable. Unwarranted surveillance is not acceptable. That disproportionate surveillance is also not acceptable. That surveillance without accountability is not acceptable. And further, turning to something a little more positive, that there should be transparency with respect to policy and its implementation. That we should be harnessing the expertise of all stakeholders to discover better ways to protect citizens in a global community. And most importantly, and core to everything we do, that we uphold human rights. So I look forward to the discussion for the rest of the day, and thank you.
Thank you, Lynn. Danny?
Thanks, Lance. So thanks to the Internet Society and GW, Lynn and Lance Paul for getting us together. I'm at the end of the panel. I'm always reminded there's a very distinguished member of Congress said near the end of a very excruciatingly long hearing, everything's been said, but not everyone has said it. So, so I subscribe to much of what has been said by many of my fellow panelists. I want to just make 3 points about what I think we've been experiencing as a result of the surveillance debate over the last month. I think fundamentally what we've had is a certain degree of a crisis in confidence and a crisis in trust about the internet environment. The question is, should you trust it or not? And as Melissa noted, it's, I think, useful to try to break down to some extent our current sources of trust in the internet in particular, in society in general. I want to just make 3 points about the institutional, legal, and political levels of trust that we tend to look to. To start with the institutional, you heard from John and from Lynn about some of the institutions that make the internet work. You know, I think it's interesting when you look purely technically at the internet, people pretty much trust that the packet's going to arrive more or less in the right order, and enough of them will get there that you can get your message through, that you can watch video. We don't have a lot of debates about that. I will note, just as a kind of a observation of the sociology in a certain way of people in the internet technical community, there is a sense, in some ways, as Lynn suggested, that if any third party can get in the middle of a communication stream between two parties, that is, in a sort of very idealized sense, a technical failure. It's the internet not working properly. Now, that's a narrow technical view of the internet environment. We, of course, have a broader legal and social and political view of our societies, and we do recognize that surveillance and espionage will happen. But part of the challenge, I think, in closing the trust gap that we have is to articulate better what those sorts of expectations are. We do have administrative institutions like that run the domain name service and IP address assignment. Thanks to people like John, they just kind of work. People grumble about ICANN, but so far, people are getting new domain names. They're being maintained. Nothing has completely fallen apart at that point. What I think is more complicated on the institutional trust front is that in many cases we're used to looking to governments to establish trustworthiness in society, and certainly governments believe their job is to establish trustworthiness in society. But as you've heard, many of our sources of trust in the internet are actually not governmental. They're working perfectly well, largely without governments, and I'll come back and talk about that. But again, because of that somewhat unusual circumstance that Lynn alluded to, these multi-stakeholder processes, we probably have to understand that a little bit better so that people can trust those environments. On when we look at legal institutions, we rely a lot on our legal institutions to establish trust in society. We hope that our legal institutions make it so that most people and most institutions mostly do the right thing most of the time. We don't expect perfection, but we do expect our legal institutions to set standards and that there are consequences when they're not followed. I think when we look at the privacy issues raised by the current surveillance practices that have been revealed, the problem that we have, I believe, is that everyone would like there to be a sense of privacy in our communications environment, but I think we have a real a lot of confusion about just what that ought to mean. We tend to think about privacy, particularly in the computer networked environment, as being able to keep things secret. Well, I think we all understand now that we don't have a lot of secrets, and we rely on lots of third parties to maintain our information. So we don't keep secrets as well as we maybe used to. And my own view is that means we have to start thinking about privacy more as a question of whether information is used properly, whether it's misused, whether it's used to discriminate unfairly against people. But that's going to require a certain amount of discussion. Lots of people have mentioned accountability. We're going to need better accountability mechanisms for these more complex privacy rules. When privacy is not a binary phenomenon, that is, either it's secret or it's not, we need mechanisms to assure trust in the way personal information is handled. I think there's a very simple analogy, actually, that we can draw from the financial world. Huge parts of our economy, huge parts of the world's economy run based on a pretty well understood set of accounting rules. We're used to looking at balance sheets for corporations and having some sense of trust that those balance sheets reflect what's actually going on in the financial life of the corporations. We don't expect to see all the transactions in the general ledger in order to look and get a picture of whether the corporation is profitable, not profitable, paying its taxes correctly, not, et cetera. Now, this doesn't always work perfectly, but I think the analogy, particularly to the NSA surveillance situation, is quite strong. We do, as citizens of the United States, want to be able to have a sense of confidence that our intelligence agencies are following the rules that they say they're following. My guess is they probably do about 90% of the time, but we want to know that there's some accountability to those rules. I think we understand that we're not going to be able to send auditors, independent auditors inside classified environments and have them come back and report on everything they found. But if we follow this balance sheet model, if we follow to a methodology of assessing how information is used, we can get that sense of trust back. Finally, as a matter of political trust, and by political I don't mean kind of small p Washington politics, I really mean politics in the sense of how we organize ourselves as a society. As people on this panel have noted, our sources of political trust are complicated in the internet environment and unusual. We're used to the idea of states, of governments exercising authority directly on institutions, often on intermediaries. But in the internet world, and if you consider the analogy between telephone networks in the past and internet service providers today, telephone networks, broadcast networks were really creatures of the state. They were authorized by the actions of legislatures and therefore controlled in that way at the local, state, federal, and even international legal level. The internet has not happened that way. It was not a creature of the state ever. It was really in many ways a creature of individual and voluntary action by some people on this panel, by others all around the world who participate in making these internet institutions work. But now, when we're nervous about how they work and how the state work, we have to rethink some of these relationships. So we're going to have to get used to the fact that governments, I would submit, cannot reach into these internet institutions like the Internet Engineering Task Force, like ICANN, like the World Wide Web Consortium, and achieve exactly the result they want. But of course, at the same time, governments will make laws and rules about how individuals and corporations act, whether for intellectual property protection or privacy protection or anything else. So I think that what the whole surveillance experience has revealed is that the rules and expectations that we have are quite a bit more nuanced than the very binary technical behavior of the internet environment. And I think our challenge is now to do a better job of articulating just what we expect of all these different institutions at all these levels and how we're going to find accountability to those expectations. Thanks.
Thank you, Danny, and thank you, everybody on the panel. I think what we'll do now, I'm going to open it up first to the panelists for 5 or 10 minutes so they can ask questions of their fellow panelists, make further comments, go some back and forth that way for 5 or 10 minutes. In the meantime, if you in the audience, if you have a question, would you please, if you're physically in the audience here at GW, step up to one of these 2 microphones in either of the aisles, form a line, and when your turn comes, please state your name and affiliation and then ask your question. If you are in the internet world, if you're off in the cloud somewhere and want to communicate, send it in. Paul, any other directions on that, or you have some questions already? You're waiting. I'm going to give the panelists a chance first, but any other protocol?
Into live stream, and I'll be reading them here at one of these mics. So that's for the live stream panelists in New York. They can just line up at their microphone there.
And if in New York, they can line up their microphone and we'll see them
We'll
lined
see
up
them,
there?
yes, that's
Okay.
right. Very good.
All right, this will be interesting. Okay, but first let's get to give the panelists a chance to ask questions. Leslie.
So I want to ask a question of Danny, because talking about the concern of persuading people that, weaning people off of government as sort of the governance structure for the internet and trying to educate them that it's not really government, it's all of these other institutions, and we do them in a multi-stakeholder way. And many people up here have spent considerable time trying to move people to that model. It just seems to me that the rest of the world right now is going to think we've been involved in a sleight of hand, that basically we're saying governments stay out, governments don't get too involved here. All these other multi-stakeholder institutions are really the core of the internet, and then at the same time building an environment where the United States uses historical dominance to basically trump all of those governance. So I hear what you're saying, but it was a hard argument to make to the rest of the world beforehand. I'm just curious whether you're continuing to say it with a straight face, but I'm having trouble.
It's a habit. I guess what I would say is that the ability to make that argument really depends on, as several people have said, the layer at which you're making the argument. I don't believe that the NSA surveillance changes one bit the question of who should be setting standards for TCP/IP, or who should be determining how domain names get assigned. I do believe that as you said, Leslie, that the question of government espionage activities, whether it's the NSA or GCHQ or MI5 or the German intelligence agency, the French intelligence agency, any one of them, all of which are doing exactly the same thing. I do believe that we now have to have a more public discussion about what our expectations are for surveillance, including espionage, in the internet environment. But that shouldn't get confused with the question of whether all of a sudden we need a treaty about how to set internet technical standards. And I believe that, I'm highly uncomfortable talking about the rest of the world, but I think that what we saw in the internet governance debate at the United Nations, at in Dubai, where the proposition from democratic countries like Iran and China and Russia was to exert greater control over the internet environment, was rejected not just by the usual suspects, that is the 34 OECD countries who you could somewhat expect to do that, but by another 20 countries from Africa and South Asia and different parts of the world that I think, and Brazil, have recognized that while we can always do better with the current internet governance arrangements, that they're working, and messing with them has a cost for all those countries. So I think as long as we keep these issues distinct and don't confuse them, I think there's a way to have both discussions in a coherent way.
Well, so I agree with you,
I know you do.
but it seems to me the opportunity here for many countries to combine them together, to not make them distinct, the opportunity to reclaim control by basically
Right.
bringing these together.
Sure. So what did Russia
is
say?
really
What
high.
did
Day
Russia
one.
say? Russia said in response to the NSA, we need more government control of both the internet infrastructure and the internet companies. I think the question is, how does anyone say that with a straight face when the concern was undue government intrusion? But yeah, people who want to make those arguments will find ways to make them.
I worry that many of those in between are suddenly going to become more persuadable because of the outrage.
So I have a question for my fellow panelists, and it's sort of following what Danny just raised. In December, we had a interesting conference, World Conference on International Telecommunications. I'll use the acronym WICET, not because I want to have the table pounded. I explained the acronym first, but you hear the term WICET, so I want to pronounce it as you might hear it. But the World Conference on International Telecommunications was to look at some treaty arrangements, some tariffs regarding interconnection, and there were a number of very interesting proposals that showed up in Dubai. And I'm struck by the timing. Because that happened, and we now have a lot of events regarding surveillance and NSA and so on and so forth. And I guess from my panelists, I'd ask the question, does anyone care to speculate if order had been reversed, what the outcome would have been? Because I've had a few people suggest that that's an interesting exercise. I am not sure whether or not the outcome that we had in Dubai in December is what we would be seeing if, in fact, it was being done instead next month.
Well, that was my concern. That's my concern.
Well, I think that if you look at the World Conference on the International Telecommunications, it was an important treaty renegotiation that hadn't been renegotiated since 1988. Is that right? 88. And as Americans, we look at these negotiations as one negotiation, and I think that that's a poor perspective, because the WICET was really about how does one monetize the internet and to pay for core infrastructure. And it is one of a multi-series of negotiations. The world, there's another telecommunications conference on policy, WTPF, that just happened in Geneva. And there'll be the World Summit on Information Society that will be culminating in 2014, I think, right? 2014, 15. And there will be 24 negotiations that go between now and then that will ultimately be where things will land. And the World Summit on Information Society will be the strategy by which will be executed in the WTPF for policy, the WCIT for regulation, and in the Internet Standards, in the International Standards Organization for the overall technology. So I think if you are a person in the corporate world and you're worried about these things, you shouldn't just look at one of these forums as one-off. And if you're worried about it from a government perspective, it's not just the policy forum or the regulatory forum, it's all of these forums, and they're all interconnected. So I would say that, yes, I think you actually suggested that it was a positive outcome at WCIT in Dubai, and I think that the United States lost in that negotiation, but and I think that the United States and many are going to continue to lose, and it's going to be a quick erosion of our stance, not a slow erosion of our stance.
We'll take one more question from the panel, if any other panelist has a question before we go out to the audience. Going once? Okay.
Mike Nelson with Bloomberg Government and with Georgetown University. I want to commend the Internet Society for a great panel. We've got the lawyers, we've got the techies, we've got the scholars, we've got the activists, and that's great, but we tend here in Washington to talk about the policy. And Danny, I tweeted your précis of your talk, which I thought was exceptional. And that was...
You got it into 142 characters? Wow.
Less than that. But you basically said, data will flow. We can't really focus, as we used to, on controlling that flow. We have to control the misuse of that data. Policymakers are starting to understand that. But I think we also have to figure out a way that techies can start implementing systems that reflect that. And the first way to do that is to make sure that systems are more transparent so that we can see where data is being misused. And I guess I'd challenge the audience to think about privacy, not to challenge the audience and the panel, to think about transparency by design. We've heard about privacy by design, but has anybody thought of examples of where we're building in the transparency so it's in the technology? And are there places where we could do that better? Just an open question.
Laura?
I think that's a really great question and a good point. I'll give one example of where I think the transparency is excellent, and then a couple of examples where I think we need more transparency. What is one of the oldest and most venerable institutions of internet governance? The Internet Engineering Task Force jumps to mind. So this is one of the standard-setting organizations for the internet. There are many others, but they've set many of the core standards. So they have a tradition of being open in 3 different ways. They're open in the development of a standard in that anyone can participate. Now, granted, there are a lot of barriers to participation. It requires a lot of technical knowledge. It requires, in many cases, money to go to some of the events and time, but it's basically open to anyone. They're also open and transparent in that the actual specification, so a standard is not really software or hardware, it's specifications that are written down and people can go online and view them. So I would differ with some of the panelists and say that, oh, the technology is political. So the technology designers make political decisions in the design, whether they like to call it that or not. So sometimes privacy is designed in. Think about encryption standards, for example. Think about unique identifiers and the privacy implications. Yet, the specification is open, so there's some degree of accountability where people can view it. It's also open in the implementation because it results in multiple competing products that are based on that standard. So that's an example. In other cases, we don't have a lot of transparency, and I agree with you that we need more. So here's an example. How do we look at interconnection? So this is an area where I'm worried because of all of the calls for greater government regulation of interconnection in an area that has worked fairly well up until now. Well, part of the reason we're seeing these calls for regulation is that we can't really see what the agreements are between these private companies. So I think it would be more helpful to have transparency in an area such as that, as well as other infrastructure areas.
So I want to go back to Danny's premise, which you apparently support, which seems to be data will flow, everybody will collect it, and we should only focus on the uses. And that's certainly a discussion we've had on sort of the consumer side of the ledger. You know, Google will collect it, and where we have to focus our attention is how they're using it. I have to submit that governments collecting information, and certainly the US government collecting information, really is subject to, I mean, in our own country, it's subject to this little thing called the Fourth Amendment. And I know of no case, and I'm willing to stand corrected, that says you can go in. I mean, this is essentially what the government is arguing in the NSA collection, and they're calling it acquisition and not collection. That acquiring the information is not collection, and that any rights that might attach don't happen until you open and look at the packets. I don't know what, you know, I've never heard anybody come into somebody's house, walk away with their desk drawer and say, we're acquiring. So we'll let you know if we ever get around to looking at it. And so, I mean, Danny and I have some disagreement, although I'm getting persuaded more and more by the question of use in the commercial side of this big data world. But I'm not willing to go there in terms of governments, and I think it's a really dangerous thing to do.
So I just to clarify, my observation that data will flow is not meant as a moral conclusion, and I think the extent to which we choose to put limits on how much data government can acquire from those who've already collected it, right? Because that's what we're talking about here, is very important. And I think that historically we have relied on technical barriers to large-scale information collection as a way to limit how much power the government has, and we don't have those anymore. So we're going to have to get very explicit about what limits we think government should have. On both the collection and the use front. My only observation, kind of back to your point, Mike, is that we're much better technically at managing collection limitation than we are managing use limitation, just as a pure matter of the kinds of computer science techniques that we have available. And I would submit that's because you know, the computer security community, cryptographers have taught us a huge amount about how to keep data secret and control access to data. There's a whole other set of disciplines developing in computer science that try to characterize information usage, track information usage, but it is a different, but there's less progress on that because I think that that's not a view of privacy that computer scientists have previously focused on. So I think you're exactly right to point out that we need more work there.
I'd actually like to hear from the techies, because I wasn't thinking so much about transparency at the institution level at layer 8. I was thinking more at the lower levels. I mean, like route tracing, you know, when we send an email to each other, you can find out where it bounced along the way.
Let me give the techies about 2 minutes before we move on to another question, because we will have a chance to circle back in the roundtable again, so we can get another bite at the apple here.
Yeah,
go ahead.
I just wanted to, just very quickly, stealing is stealing. It doesn't matter whether it's in the physical world or in the cyber world. So whatever the techniques you have to collect data of a theft in the physical world, you can apply those same techniques in the cyber world. The difference is speed. I mean, it takes me physically a long time to go in and steal a laptop from the gentleman's desk there, but I can steal all the information on his laptop in a second, and probably as long as it took me to do it, if I can connect it over the net. So the comment about the government, you know, and the search warrant and the Constitution, you should, you know, that's why it's there. That's why we have the Constitution, is to follow those laws. And you can still achieve the same goals and stay within the constitutional limits. It's been done. It's just that what's happened is we've got a bunch of people at the policy level that didn't understand what the implications are. And that's where everything that they've done has been legal. The law is the problem, not what they're,
Well,
not whether they're doing it
I
or
would
that.
question that.
Yeah.
But
Okay, I'm going to
You be
move
the
this along
technologist,
because
I'll be the
I want to
lawyer.
give John, I want to give John a chance, and then
Go
I'm
ahead,
sure
John.
Steve's getting a lot of fodder for the roundtable to come
So-
back to us
Yeah.
later on.
So I do want to pick up on one thing, which is the internet has a tradition or a convention, I wouldn't say tradition, a convention of protocols which behave in an open manner. And so this is, for example, when you're looking at how packets flow, there are commands like traceroute that let you see how they go through the internet. And you can map them through an exchange point most of the time. When you look at mail headers, you can look at email headers, and you can actually see, wow, that's how my email got from point A to point B. And it's visible, and you can see those most of the time. When you look at a packet that you've received, you can look at the source address and say, oh, where's that from? And you can look it up and find it most of the time. Now, there's no obligations that any of this information is accurate. It's all sufficiently accurate to keep the internet running, or at least so far, and we hope it will let us keep it running, but there's no actual obligations. And you need to be careful, because while there would be some benefit to having an attribute that says there's an actual obligation to make this accurate, then I see people emerging saying, well, wait a second, now I'm worried about my anonymity, because now you can trace my IP or you can trace my email. So we have just a convention of transparency, which has been enough to keep the internet running. There is a question of whether or not that's going to actually work long term. The point that was made by Randy, which is that the rate at which you can attack something digitally is a lot faster than physically. And this means that the ability to have an accountable internet where we can actually figure out who sent the bomb threat or figure out who sent the email which caused the problem at the school is potentially a very large duty, and it may require us making a trade-off between anonymity and curated anonymity in order to have accountability.
Okay,
Right now, it's not clear that one or the other is the right answer.
So we may well circle back to this in the roundtable. Let me move on to the next questioner over here.
All right, Amadou Daffy, co-founder of Codis for Africa. This is more towards the techie side too, but at the same time from a global view. We represent thousands of developers in Africa. And in the upcoming years, there's going to be more software developers who are going to be creating thousands of applications on mobile and web. And one of the things is, what are the strategies there when you have emerging countries or emerging economy jumping on the bandwagon of using the internet to do transactions with the US or the Western world? What do you think what would happen? Because I could be in a country like Senegal, do some hacking, I can do anything I can because I have access to maybe the continent level network, but as well as the Western world. What are your strategies on that?
Well, this is where the law comes into play. What we hear on the techie side, for instance, is, of course, there's laws on hacking in the U.S., but there's no laws on hacking in China, as we would understand them. So each country gets to define, what a hacking is. Some may take it as an assault against the government if you are hacking. Some may just say it's a plain and simple theft. So you're going to have to, I would think you'd have to look at each individual country's definition of what they consider to be hacking in that case. Now, on the other side, again, if you're writing an application for someone like that, then you're going to do logging, you're going to do all of this type of stuff because you want to provide an auditor, if you will, if it's a financial application, with some record of whatever transactions your software handles. So there's always going to be a record of something that either your app did or where your app went. Whether it's accurate or not, that's another question, but there's always going to be a record. And again, metadata analysis, I can use that and make some inferences as to what you did, even though I can't see what's in your individual packets, but if you encrypted them.
John?
So there's an amazing wake-up call here. So we have this internet that's remarkable, allows people to interact, people in different countries with different expectations to interact. And yet the conventions by which governments work haven't evolved fast enough. The idea that citizen in country A is interacting with citizen in country B, and it might be illegal in one country and not in another, is a whole new concept that governments are going to take some time to try to figure out how to deal with. So we have a problem. We literally have an internet that has capabilities that governments haven't come to grip on how to handle their duties and responsibilities. I know governments that feel very strongly about protecting their citizens against pornography or against certain types of content. I know governments in other countries that feel very strongly that that's up to each citizen. But the reality is that that intersection has now happened because of the internet. Two governments can have very different views on what their responsibilities to their citizens are. So to answer your question, in a general case, the internet's moved faster than governments. Governments literally do not know how to interact with the situation you described. On a practical matter, if you end up doing something of significance, something that causes a lot of harm, or actually it was a very nice list of types of attacks: destruction of property, theft of intellectual property, different types of extortion or DDoS. If you actually do something of a major magnitude, you'll find out that law enforcement does cooperate between countries and works very well. It's just not set up for the scale of the internet, and it's in the age of the cooperation between law enforcement and various computer response teams is one step above fax machines ringing and going back and forth. We have the mechanism to handle the really bad events fairly slowly. We don't have anything to handle the scale of automatic attacks happening 24 hours a day around the entire globe. We just don't.
Let me move to Danny. He wanted to say something, and then I'm going to move on to the next question. By the way, I can't really tell if anybody in New York wants to ask a question, so if they do, I guess they'll stand up or something, or else go through Paul. Danny, go ahead.
I just want to make one observation about the challenge of international law enforcement cooperation. Most people in this room are probably familiar with the SOPA debate, the SOPA law that was proposed in the United States. In a certain sense, we only had that debate with all of its cataclysm because of the failure of current mechanisms in international law enforcement cooperation. We had that debate. Congress was considering that law blocking access to websites outside the United States that might have infringing content because people in Congress were concerned that U.S. law enforcement didn't have an effective way of working with law enforcement authorities from the countries where the infringement was actually happening. I think that we have to get a lot better, as John is suggesting, at enforcement cooperation. There are realms where that works reasonably well, but the problem is it's mostly cooperation in the form of how to make a criminal conviction against someone stick. Law enforcement cooperation mechanisms are good at exchanging evidence and make sure that you have the information you need to bring someone to trial, but not good at actually stopping the behavior that may be harmful as it's happening. So I think it's a very big challenge.
All right, go to Paul for a...
I actually did see that David Salmanoff, the New York Society's chapter president, would like to have a question. So why don't we go to him if he will do that? I think they have a little bit of a delay, so he might just be hearing this a second later.
Okay, David.
I actually did see that David Salmanoff, the New York Society's chapter president, would like to have a question. So why don't we go to him and people can...
Okay, that's your cue, David. Go on.
Okay. Oh, speak to the camera then, or? Yeah, sure. Okay, so...
I actually did see that David Salmanoff, the New York Society's chapter president, would like to have a question. So why don't we go to him and people can...
Okay. Yeah. Okay, we have some delay here. My question is, what sort of scenarios do our panelists envision, and what would be some alternative solutions if our government, specifically Congress, is unwilling or unable to rein in agencies such as the NSA in terms of surveillance? If they can't do it or choose not to, what would be the consequences Are there technical solutions or are there policy solutions that could be implemented without the U.S. government?
Okay, the panelists are being asked, is there a workaround Congress?
I'm just going to speak at it just as an individual, not as a panel member. But if Congress can't rein in a government agency, we have a lot more serious problems than what's going on the internet.
When was the last time we passed a federal budget?
You know, I mean, they're a government agency. Congress has to do that. Now, again, there's classified information and all this other stuff that can influence how laws pass. But quite frankly, if Congress didn't have that power to do it, we wouldn't see General Alexander making a run up to talk to members. I think, was it today?
Votes tomorrow.
Yeah, the votes tomorrow. So, you know, doing that. So certainly, I would think Congress has the ability to do that and should have the ability, or else we don't have a democracy.
Okay, any other panelists want to weigh in on that? Lynn?
I could just say quickly that
Go ahead.
sorry,
No,
Liz.
please.
That, you know, there are ways for people to manage their traffic. And I'm certainly certain there will be even more ways for people to manage their traffic and choose the routing. We actually are quite concerned about that because it will make the global internet much less resilient. Putting something in a box doesn't mean it may be protecting it from one country actually examining it, but it doesn't protect the other country. And so I'm not actually quite sure what David's question was, but you know, if it's about routing and the ability to route around what you see as a problem, I think we need to be very, very careful about what some of those potential solutions are, because I don't think it will address the problem you're trying to route around. And in fact, it will, over time, make the global internet much less resilient.
Paul?
Okay, I have a question from Livestream. It's from Garth Graham. He asks, is the real issue autonomy and self-determined choice rather than privacy? And if so, what is the role of identity in addressing the issue of trust?
Well, I'll take one stab at that. I think that in the discussions of privacy over the last 10 years or so, maybe longer, I think that we've gotten a little bit distracted by the promise of individual choice as somehow the key to privacy. I think that a lot of the privacy values, and what I mean by that is the dialog boxes that everyone sees in, you know, one website or another, where you have to click here to accept a privacy policy or swat away a dialog box to proceed. And I think certainly it's actually a remarkable point of convergence between the United States and Europe. In the last couple years, both the White House and the Federal Trade Commission issued major privacy policy statements that noted the limitations of this so-called notice and choice or individual determination model. The Europeans certainly have pointed that out as well. A lot of the things that we value associated with privacy are collective values. We want to make sure people can associate freely, can engage in politics, can engage in commerce, can seek medical care, et cetera. And I think that giving people the choices to opt out of those things or somehow control their identity when they're trying to speak to their doctor or make a public political statement really seems to be exactly the opposite of some of our core privacy values. So I think that there are situations in which individual autonomy is quite important, but a little bit also to the last question about the NSA, I don't think we get ourselves out of these privacy problems by just giving people, you know, 20K long encryption keys to wield against everyone else.
Laura?
That's a really interesting question, and I want to tie it back to something that I think Danny said before about data will flow. And you know, while I agree with that, that's also not necessarily the case. We have interconnection disputes that have resulted in outages. We've had countries that have cut off access for their citizens. We have areas of the world that have infrastructures of complete censorship. We have digital divide issues. We have trends away from interoperability, where we're going in the cloud to more proprietary protocols, for example. So data will not necessarily flow, but one of the things that is required for it to flow is this issue of trust that the questioner brought up. So I think I can mention just a couple of areas, or maybe three, that are very important. So the trust has always existed between network providers to exchange information about IP addresses that are either in their control or that they can reach on the internet. But we've seen examples, that's done through Border Gateway Protocol. There have been examples where false routes have been advertised, whether intentionally or not, and outages have occurred. So there are efforts underway now to secure that, which are very necessary. So we have to build trust into the network. It's not something that we can just assume. Has to be designed in, has to be built in. The same thing with how the domain name system works. We have servers located around the world that resolve queries of domain names. Like maybe I'm up here looking at CNN.com. I'm not, but the domain name server would resolve that into its IP address and route the information. Well, that can be gamed also, in that there can be a false return of a query. So having things like domain name system security extensions has to be continued to be implemented. You know, these are just a few of the examples in answer to the question that it has to be designed in. Same thing with website authentication. If I'm saying that correctly, the role of certificate authorities and how they verify through digital signatures that a website is who the website says it is. So again, this is an example of the politics of the architecture. It's not just about agreements between people, but about designing this trust and identity into the infrastructure.
I'm going to move on to the next question just because I want to give the audience as much opportunity as I can, because the panelists are going to be able to circle back on these later on. Over here.
So I'm Luke Wadman. I'm a student working as a policy analysis intern for IEEE this summer. I'm working on internet governance issues. And does the panel think there's any, would it be a good way to frame the debate on privacy and internet governance and et cetera in economic terms? Because if I've learned anything in my time in DC, it's that catching the ear of our congressional representatives is easy if you start talking about jobs and job creation. And we've already talked a little bit about the impact of things like PRISM on US-based IT companies like Google and Facebook, particularly in the EU, but also around the world. One case is that Google isn't really competitive in China, and that's probably going to continue in that direction. So would that be a good way to frame this whole conversation and actually encourage some sort of positive congressional action?
So I would never say that I have any idea how to encourage positive congressional action. Just want to put that on the table. I think it is true that everything that's happened in this sort of last 6 weeks inside this sort of NSA bubble has happened without any reference as to what it might, the impact that it might have on US industry. And I think it is possible that the impact, at least in the short run, may be severe. On the other hand, a lot of people may carry on about being unhappy about discovering that the NSA is sucking up their data. Historically, when the big if you look at the SOPA fight, which I think was probably the first time that US internet industry sort of held hands with activists and technologists, it does get Congress's attention. I will say, though, that national security is different. It is just always different, and the arc of national security has been more since 9/11, and the question is whether these revelations have sort of pushed us beyond the more and more place.
Okay, let's move over here.
Hi, I'm Susan Aronson with GW. I'm a professor here, and I work with the World Wide Web Foundation on measuring internet openness. And I want to ask you all a question that relates to trust, but trust of policymakers. So in the last couple of days, we've seen Viviane Reding and Angela Merkel make these delightful comments about server locations and threats in terms of privacy. And again, I wonder if there are, so they're basically saying if the server can't be located where we can control, where our privacy rules dominate, we might not accept, for example, some of the things the United States wants in a trade agreement, or, and we see similar things with the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and I just wonder if you could talk a little bit about this now. You know, you can always, for national security reasons, you can always say you have a particular policy in place and it's not protectionist. But this is the opposite of it, right? They're saying that for privacy reasons, they want to essentially protect their citizens from their information being traded by having the server location in the United States. If I may add one other thing, which is Frank LaRue, who is the UN Special Representative on Freedom of Expression, he has said basically that the U.S. failure to protect privacy is a violation of its human rights obligations, because that is a basic human right under the Universal Declaration, blah, blah, blah. So I want to hear your comments.
Sure, I'll do it.
Whole lot there.
The Trans-Pacific Partnership and the EU-US Free Trade Agreement is and always will have had to address the data privacy laws. The safe harbor that we had in place in 2001 will actually expire with the agreement. And the United States, as you know, has no national umbrella for data breach and data privacy. We have 47 individual states with their individual programs and no national umbrella. And so if we were calling for congressional action that had an economic, significant impact, there are 52 pieces of legislation currently in the 113th Congress around cybersecurity, about 10 of which are on data breach. It would be wonderful if we could get to some bipartisan agreement on that so we could enable the overall free trade agreement to move forward between the two continents. More specifically, though, noting the 47 different state laws and noting the difference between the Europe and the United States, cloud computing and where the data is stored follows the geography and will always follow the geography. So if there's a data breach here in the state of Virginia, it follows a different set of rules than Massachusetts and in California. And a company, whoever the company might be, actually has to know all sets of laws for the particular state in this case in order to follow the regulatory and compliance, et cetera. That also is the same for if it's stored in the United Kingdom, it follows the United Kingdom's laws, in the Netherlands and Brazil, and you pick the place. And so when the EU and the leaders of Germany and elsewhere are talking about the data protection and data privacy, and they are looking at the United States and worried about how we're protecting data and the privacy, then it would be also important to understand how the European companies are mirroring data in other countries like Brazil or South Africa or Egypt or China or India, et cetera, because the data always follows the law of the geography that it sits in.
I'll just add to that one of the things that, obviously the NSA revelations have sort of strengthened the EU's hand in a discussion that was going on long before. They have a particular view of what privacy means. It doesn't match up. Going back to this question earlier about, what economic kind of motivation might move Congress, one would think the U.S. companies would move forward on a comprehensive data protection regime in the United States that might be more flexible and perhaps reflect the internet more than the European one, but I haven't seen them step forward on that. I think it would be interesting for somebody to ask the question about the various EU countries and their surveillance regimes, because as much as I say some very unpleasant things about ours, I think you would find that with the exception of our capacity for the just incredible scale of collection, that the actual legal protections are no better at best and probably a lot worse.
Just one comment on the trade discussions. Susan, I think it's a very important question. I certainly think that, as you well know, better than probably anyone in this room, trade agreements have always made exceptions for things like national security, public morals, sometimes consumer protection, things like that. I think what we see now is that simply pushing them off, those issues off into the exception category is not going to work. So we need some kind of mechanism that, on the one hand, respects the fact that governments do have a legitimate and important interest in protecting their citizens against unsafe products, against human rights violations, if that's the way they view privacy, against security breaches, what have you. But tying that to the location of data is I think just an overly simplistic way of accomplishing that purpose. And I think you could make fancy trade arguments about why that's not most favored nation treatment. But I think the bottom line is we used to have trade agreements that were fundamentally about tariffs, and we've mostly dealt with those issues. And now we are going to have trade agreements that are fundamentally about the non-tariff barriers that exist between economies. So we're going to have to deal with it. I think that for some period of time, I think the surveillance issues will cloud those discussions, but we'll come back to them at some point, and they will be the same issues. The only final thing I would say, I think that one of the big challenges we're going to have in the trade context on internet issues is the challenge that we found with ACTA, that ACTA was making.
Abbreviation.
Sorry. Oh, God, Steve is going to throw a book at me. So there was a trade agreement involving intellectual property enforcement, whose acronym is ACTA. And was very strenuously opposed by civil society groups all over the world because they didn't know what it was. They didn't know what was in the agreement, and they argued, I thought quite legitimately, that if there are going to be rules made about intellectual property rights that affect individuals, there should be some public discussion of what those rules are. Trade people believe they somehow can't negotiate in public, and it's a sort of an article of faith in the trade world. They're going to have to learn to be a little bit more public if they're going to get anything done on these issues, is my view.
Lynn, you get the last word before the
Just
break.
very quickly, not only it wasn't that they wouldn't negotiate in public, they would not authorize the release of the documents post-negotiation.
That's right.
They were not available publicly.
Yes.
So this sounds like a thread circling back to NSA and FISA and all that. But I am sorry that we have hit the point where we promised we were going to take a very brief 5-minute break, let you get a chance to stretch your legs. Then we're going to come back, and people on the panel will mix it up some more, even better, I suspect, moderated by Steve Roberts. But let's take a quick 5-minute break. There will be one other opportunity for you all to meet and greet at least most of the panelists, and there's a reception that starts at 5:15 afterwards. But for now, 5-minute break. We'll reconvene at 4 o'clock. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dan.
Well, thanks for sticking around. I know it's been a long afternoon. And as Lance said, I'm Steve Roberts. I'm a professor here at GW in the School of Media and Public Affairs right across the street. My job is to try to crystallize some of the issues that we've been discussing and foment some conversation among the panelists. And I want to start by quoting a couple of things I heard. Lynn, for instance, said that unwanted surveillance is not acceptable. Leslie talked a lot about human rights. But there was a phrase that I did not hear the entire first hour and a half, except in passing, and that word was national security. And so I want to pose this question to the panel. Isn't national security a human right? Isn't safety a human right? Isn't the unwanted surveillance, one person's unwanted surveillance is another person's protection from danger and from terrorism? So I want to ask everybody, what's the trade-off here? The whole idea in the first half of this panel was the importance of the freedoms of the internet. But what are the limits? And what are the legitimate trade-offs? And how do we balance legitimate human rights against legitimate rights to be safe from terrorism and other threats? Who wants to start? Go ahead, John.
So I'm going to almost answer the question, but not quite. It is true that the governments have certain roles and responsibilities. And one of those roles is there's a certain protection, a certain defensive role that a government feels it has to provide. And the question is, how do governments do what they see as their obligations, their actual responsibilities, given the internet? The internet has not been very good at this, okay? So,
excuse me, it's not just an obligation. It's not just something that they passing. This is the first obligation of government, is to protect people. Isn't it the first obligation?
I deal, one of the things that Aaron does, of course, is we're responsible for maintaining a registry of IP addresses, and that registry is often used because someone does something in cyberspace, and the first thing law enforcement would like to know is, where is that in the real world? Because real world has to do with people and organizations, and the cyberspace has to do with domain names and IP addresses. And so governments feel they have to enforce laws, for example. And yet the internet wasn't built with an interface for government saying, if you're trying to do your duty, here's how you go about finding that person. Here's how you go about doing what you see as an obligation. So I know a lot of people look at this and they go, this entire area of governments and what they want to do with the internet, and they want to take control and they want to do surveillance. If you turn it around and look at it, remember that from the government's perspective, in many cases, these governments feel they have an obligation, and the internet is actively preventing them from doing something they're required by their citizens to do. So we need to not omit the fact that the internet doesn't provide a friendly interface to government. Some people would see that as a feature, but it's a fact that shouldn't be overlooked in the discussion.
Trade-off. What's the trade-off, Leslie?
So I want to back us up. This is not a new question, and it doesn't have to do with the internet. I mean, we have an international human rights framework that explicitly makes national security an exception in human rights treaties. It is an obligation of the countries themselves to protect our national security. But we also have an entire developed jurisprudence about publicly enacted, transparent law, proportionate law, fair process, remedy, and oversight. And I think if we just throw this into the internet context, we're just missing. There's there's bodies of law and norms. And the question here is not whether there's a trade-off, it's whether you reach a balance. And I think when you have most of this process secret, the judicial process secret, the oversight secret, the interpretation of the law secret, then you cannot achieve that balance. The question at the end of the day is balance. I certainly would take issue with the idea that the internet has been unfriendly to law enforcement, and it's always this, we're going dark and we can't see anything. I think if we've learned anything over the last couple of months, it's that law enforcement really has access to much more information, and that there is therefore a temptation to use what technology has created to go beyond what a balanced human rights frame would allow. And I think that's what our problem is. Not that they're not supposed to be, it is a first order of business for government. They are supposed to protect their citizens. But Steve, if you look at this framework that's been created, it was a framework that was created on a battlefield in Iraq to make sure that you had every last possible bit of information to make sure you would know about the IED. And this whole haystack and needle analogy assumes that collecting a haystack is proportionate, and I don't think it is.
But the president has said this program of surveillance is essential. The director of national security has said it's essential. The chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, a liberal former mayor of San Francisco, says it's essential. What's your quarrel with this? And how do you rebut their argument of everybody who has had access to the secret say this is justifiable? I'd like the other people to deal with this. Yeah.
Could I just?
Laura.
Go ahead, Laura.
Okay. So there's so many portrayals of this as a binary, and I think the issue is more one of degrees and a more granular issue. But there are some binaries here, right? We either have a constitution or we don't. We either have a Fourth Amendment or we don't. But if you start looking at the actual practices, and I don't think we have a full picture of exactly what's going on, but based on some of the things that we've heard, there are ways to enact the necessary national security without crossing lines that would be unacceptable to the majority of people. So having so layers of control and layers of accountability in the processes of surveillance, right? So not just having any low-level analyst being able to take a fire hose of information and download that onto their computer just to exaggerate the point, right? So there's the granularity, there's getting the information that's necessary, there's the process of accountability, there's the issue of judicial review. So I think that there are ways to enact the necessary national security now that our public sphere is online and now that we have the privatization of that public sphere without going to the extremes of basically having the fire hose analogy and just downloading whatever data about anybody.
Anybody else on the panel want to pick up on this? Please, go ahead.
So you want us to talk about trade-offs, but I actually want to suggest that I think a more accountable, clear system is better for national security. I think what's happening now, where you have very, very broad authorities that are unclear, is almost the worst of all possible worlds for both civil liberties and national security, because you have policy officials, other governments, activists, et cetera, poking around in the business of the intelligence community, and that's not a very good thing for them, frankly. They want to be able to do what they do quietly, but in order for us to do that, in order for that to happen, there has to be a clear sense of what the rules are. The one sense in which, I largely agree with Leslie, but the one sense in which I think this is an internet problem is it's really kind of a 9/11 problem, in that I think a lot of what's gone on has gone on under the kind of exceptional basis that we've handled a lot of national security issues post 9/11. And to quote the president again, ironically enough, just a few weeks before this whole surveillance story broke, the president went to the National Defense University, as you know, and gave a speech saying, number one, it is bad for a country to be perpetually at war, and number two, that the threat level from Al-Qaeda was basically below the level that it was at on 9/11, and that we should start treating that threat, that national security threat, as part of the norm, not as an exception that we have to respond to with these kinds of exceptions. This whole surveillance program was created as the president's surveillance program, as you know, as an exception, and that's its problem. The
Although
problem is
continued
not
by a
this-
Democratic president, a Democratic.
That's right, but I think that it needs to be continued on a more clear, accountable basis. And so I don't tend to accept that the issue gets solved by saying more surveillance, less surveillance. I think that the issue is surveillance according to what rules and with what accountability.
Lynn, I quoted you. Please, your turn.
Yeah, I mean, I'll come to my other point in a moment, but just to be clear, I actually said unwarranted surveillance. I recognize the difficulty in unwanted from the perspective of the individual. So it's very much unwarranted.
Thank you.
And I just really want to echo the three comments that have been made here very, very, very strongly. When in a system like the internet, which is breaking all barriers, we're so interconnected and so interdependent, we have to change our paradigm of looking at this and move it to one of managing risk. We can talk about it in the context of trade-offs, if you'd like, but we really do have to
Well, isn't that the only context? Isn't trade-offs the only legitimate way to talk about it? Because isn't that what we do every day?
I think trade-offs is a legitimate way, but I'm not sure we're making the right trade-offs. And I think we continue to focus on national security and quite often run by flagrant abuses. Then we're conflating the issue or we're not pulling it apart. It's not about national security and what is the best way to protect national security. From my perspective, you know, what our members are extremely upset about is the flagrant abuses and the lack of transparency and the secrecy.
Yes, please.
Well, I think part of the problem that I have with hearing what they've said, given the reasons, is we haven't heard a reason that makes sense. Why are you collecting the data? It's like the equivalent of your mom and dad saying, well, because I said so. You have to give us something behind that. You know, is there a credible threat at whatever level there is? I think Danny's right. I think the threat level, from what we've read in previous speeches by the president, is that the threat level is a lot less than it was at 9/11. Well, if it's a lot less than it was at 9/11, why do we need to expand this? Give us something to look at. But I think when I hear them talk about these things and give these reasons, as somebody who does this type of metadata analysis and just as for my own infrastructure, well, certainly in my own infrastructure, I can do a lot of that analysis. But there's an uplink to me. And those people that control that infrastructure, my infrastructure, your infrastructure, they can do the same type of analysis, and it trees all the way up. So why? Why? You have to give us a credible reason.
But what was running through a lot of your comments is a basic mistrust of government. I mean, you've been told, or the public has been told by the intelligence committees, which have been briefed, that this is a very valuable tool, PRISM, and other surveillance is a very valuable tool. The president, duly elected Democratic liberal president, has said it's a very valuable tool. The liberal chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee has said it's a very valuable tool. And every one of you is doubting it. So what is the source of your suspicions and your mistrust of what you're being told?
So I actually don't, I mean, there's no way for us to know if it's a valuable tool or not a valuable tool. So you could take them at face value that it's a valuable tool. Collection of data is a valuable thing. It's just not the only analysis in a democratic society. And I think, so, I mean, that's, I think, the problem here. We live in a democratic society where we're supposed to have proportional laws that more than a small number of people are able to know about to assess that balance between liberty and security. We really don't have that. I mean, if this was a discussion that they were tasking these companies with specific requests based on articulable facts about specific individuals or even several hundred individuals, we might be having a different discussion about the balance between liberty and security. But we're having a discussion about the value of basically collecting the data potentially on everybody in the world. I mean, we don't know the set. So it's not about trust of government or not. I think you could probably devise a program where you know everything about everybody in the world and claim it makes you safer. Maybe it makes you safer. But we've but we no longer are following either the values, the Constitution, or the norms of the country.
Well, you say you're not following the Constitution. These laws were passed by a democratically elected Congress.
Well, having been there,
yeah,
having
right.
been there, they didn't know what they were passing, and they didn't know what.
So,
what
yeah,
it
but
should
that's,
be.
but you just said the issue wasn't trust. Now you just say, well, they didn't know what they were passing. If you believe, let me ask you the question.
Okay.
If you believe in a democratic system, now you're saying, I don't believe in the democratic
No.
process that's passed these laws, that they were misinformed and we know better.
No, the laws have been, after the fact, stretched and manipulated in ways that Congress didn't intend. And that's where we've gone off the rails. Nobody who was in Congress at the time of Section 215, the metadata law that we're talking about, which is aimed specifically at U.S. citizens, in making the changes they were making, nobody believed that relevant data meant everybody in the United States.
Let me ask you.
So, this is ultimately, yes, it's a question of trust insofar as the people implementing the law have made it as elastic as possible without it completely exploding, and it might now be
John.
exploding.
I've expressed no view on whether it's desirable or undesirable, or whether it's illegal or legal. Neither of those questions are really interesting to me. When it comes to the internet, though, the question is, there's a set of events going on regarding surveillance. And the internet is global in nature. We have allies and trading partners and organizations globally, other governments, who want to understand what's going on because they may have the same desire. There may be another government that wishes for its reasons to engage in surveillance of communication in its country. And it wants to understand what is the framework by which this is occurring, and how does it happen in the internet? How is it supported? How does it go on? Because they have their own national interests, and they may pass laws in their region that are perfectly fine and acceptable according to their processes. So we now have this framework that says there are circumstances during which surveillance is apparently an accepted part of the architecture. What we don't have is a transparency about where that's occurring and how that occurs and what happens if another 130 countries also do it. I believe that if we're to have equitable internet governance, it's necessary to have a fully articulated and transparent framework. I do not know whether or not everyone's going to like what their country chooses for what it does with surveillance or not. That's a different question. That's a question of laws and governance structure. But if this is going to go on, we need to understand where it occurs and how it occurs, and the fact that it could be occurring in a lot of places. And that should be understood and documented as part of a clearly transparent recognition that this is part of the internet.
Let me ask you all this question. You say you're not interested in legality, but one of the key debates here is the legal framework for PRISM and the FISA law. There's not much debate about whether what's been taking place is legal or not under the law, but there's a big debate about whether the law is the right law and whether the framework should be altered. If you all were to testify before intelligence committees and others on the Hill and asked, how should this law be changed to advance the values you're talking about, what would be some of your suggestions? Go ahead.
Well, I think we have to start by walking out the changes that we made in the records law, because we took out all the words that make it proportionate and make it targeted, and transformed it into a broad collection statute. And I think there are ways to walk it back that allows substantial collection of targets and information related to that targets, and backs it out of this broad relevancy standard that allows it, one, to be collected on anybody, but also not, it just takes out the whole national security purpose. Basically, you no longer have to be collecting because of a particular terrorist or particular intelligence activity. You only have to be collecting in order to be protecting the United States. And that is simply too broad and too likely to abuse. It is harder for me to know how to change 702 because we still don't understand what they're doing.
Anybody else got a thought about this?
Except for greater transparency.
Because this is going to be debated in the weeks and months ahead. It's a very important question.
But the traditional method of before the haystack law, if you allow me to call it that, before that was placed, the traditional methods of law enforcement worked. And they would work with whatever the internet had to provide. You needed to identify somebody. You usually identified them through a non-technical aspect. You had an informant, somebody tell you, hey, I think that you're doing something illegal. And that puts the focus on you. From there, you would use your traditional tools, whether they were on the net or not, to find out what's going on. Collecting data when there's no evidence of a crime is kind of counterintuitive and counterproductive in a way, because it's sitting there. So if it were me and I was an adversary of the United States, I would find where that database was being stored, and I would go after it to collect all that information, because I can do the same type of metadata analysis that could be done that way. The third thing is the reason why you mentioned earlier that maybe we mistrusted is because we know what can be done with that data, and we know when somebody is giving us a smoke answer. Because I know that if I control my infrastructure, I know the power that I have given my office. I have to act responsibly and within the laws and all that. But I know what can be done if there's no oversight on my position. And that's why I think you hear.
But there is oversight. It is. I mean,
it would be if you were the oversight committee for what I would do technically. Do you have the technical skills to know what I'm doing?
That's another question.
So I'm going to leave the legal. So the legal policy questions, I largely agree with what has been said. I don't think that we have adequate oversight. And if I were talking to Congress about what to do to increase the trust in this environment, I would say that Congress and the FISA court needs a more effective accountability mechanism. There is no way that the FISA court judges or the members of the intelligence community are looking at every single query that NSA analysts are performing on this enormous amounts of data. It is technically possible to do that, to Mike Nelson's earlier point, to actually evaluate whether when Bob Litt, the general counsel of ODNI, says, yeah, we have the whole haystack, but we only ask questions based on certain predicates. I know Bob, and I more or less trust him, but I think it's outrageous for the government to say to its citizens, don't worry, trust us. We give the government considerable authority, but we need mechanisms to make sure it's being used responsibly. And none of the oversight mechanisms that exist that you've mentioned are able to provide that kind of accountability, other than to call up a responsible person like Mr. Litt and say, are you following the rules? And he says, yes, we're following the rules. He doesn't even know what every single analyst does in the agency.
Let me ask you about it. One of the proposals that has been made and is widely debated in Washington is a lot of people have pointed out one of the flaws, critics have pointed out one of the flaws in the FISA process is there's no adversarial mechanism within the FISA system, that the government comes in and asks for permission, and there is no counter voice, there's no adversarial proceeding, and in most legal systems there is a mechanism for challenging. So a number of legislative proposals have been advanced in one form or another. Is this one of the mechanisms that the Congress should be looking at to try to reorder this balance that many of you think is out of whack? Leslie?
Yeah, I actually think this question of some kind of a public advocate, and I think it's probably, we figured out how to give private lawyers the ability to look at classified information in criminal procedures. We ought to be able to come up with a stable of those people who litigate in the national security state, who can stand in for the public. And I think it's one of many potential points of sort of strengthening oversight here. I think it's critically important. I think different levels of sort of reporting back to the FISA court. I think part of the problem and the reason that people are responding is, I mean, it's interesting, FISA was a civil liberties measure when it was adopted in 1978. And, you know, it's basically my mentors were the civil libertarians who proposed this crazy idea. And the world is really different than it was in 1978. And being in contact with a foreign person, I mean, you know, there was an iron curtain. If they could actually figure out you were communicating with a foreign person, it probably had some significance. We now live in this world where 20% of us are first generation, where our corporations are global, where we travel all the time, and where people don't identify themselves in that same kind of we-them way, and yet we have a law and a designation of foreign persons that really is a Cold War era and almost has to be reconsidered all by itself. And the law can't be working very well because it's not supposed to sweep up Americans' communications. And all you have to do is read the minimization guidelines to understand how much of our communications are.
Hal Burgle wrote an interesting article that just came out in IEEE Computer magazine. It's called Through the Prism Darkly. And there's a quote in there that he says, "The Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court has an approval rate of 99.93% of all surveillance requests. While this might not meet the strict definition of a kangaroo court, it seems to fall within the marsupial family." So the point of it is that there are two, he calls them cyber urban myths that deal with this. One is that you do need all of this, information to do it, and that there's sufficient oversight. And I think we all agree there's not sufficient oversight. You wouldn't ask me to be on a medical oversight committee to review surgical procedures, because I'm not a doctor, I'm not a surgeon, I don't have that expertise in that area. And so I think that's the thing that bothers the technology people is we know it is a small community of the actual people that know the nuts and bolts about technology security from that standpoint. And if we don't know each other personally, we know each other by reputation and whatever. And so when you look and you query your other peers, and they have the same misgivings that you do, then it makes you wonder what's going on.
I just want to make one other point about the people who are being swept up in this surveillance. I think one of the reasons that more fine-grained accountability is really critical is we don't know, but I think it's a safe assumption that somewhere north of 90% of the people who are on any of these terrorism watch lists, who are the targets of any of this surveillance, are Arab Americans or have some connection to the Middle East, many of whom are probably Muslims. In this country, we don't have a great history of treating minorities perfectly fairly. And part of the reason we have oversight mechanisms, part of the reason we have open courts, part of the reason we try to have due process with public visibility is to make sure that we actually do our job in really treating people fairly and not discriminating. And again, I think it's really interesting. You hear this panel, you hear the public discussion. I don't think there are that many people saying stop the surveillance. People are not saying that. I was in Boston during the marathon bombings. People are clamoring for the installation of more cameras. The question, I really believe, is not about whether law enforcement should have these tools. It's about whether we can feel confident that they're using them responsibly.
One of you made the point that actually this is not a new issue. That just a few years ago, Washington Post did an expose, a very lengthy one, Dana Priest and others, and there was not anything like the same kind of reaction that there's been lately. And I'm wondering why you think, what's the difference? Why has there been why are we having this panel and not 3 years ago? Why is there so much conversation now about this issue when, in fact, at least some of this was made known through the Post and other mechanisms some years ago?
Smartphones.
We didn't have the numbers. I mean, from the Verizon order, we now know. I don't remember how many millions of people's records were, tens of millions of people's records were collected. We had general outlines from the Post reporting, from all kinds of things. But it was not dramatized with numbers. And I think, and now we know it's basically everyone's data. We never actually knew that was happening.
Right. I think that's right. I also think there was an uproar when the warrantless wiretapping was first revealed. We had a very big battle in Congress. People were really worried about it. People who were not following it closely, and they passed an amendment, might have actually thought that what we wound up with was some kind of additional procedural protections. Instead, what wound up with was a ratification of that program, immunity for the providers, and not much more. And so, I think a lot of us knew some of this was going on, but I think we didn't know. One of my colleagues, Jim Dempsey, who's on the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board, wrote an article saying, did they just approve a vacuum cleaner? And lots of people then responded with, oh, that's ridiculous. Well, no, in fact, they approved a vacuum cleaner, and
Laura?
we didn't know it.
Laura?
I agree with those points. I think it is a matter of scale in this case, but I think there are a few other points too that are a little bit more subtle. So one issue is that this came after Hillary Clinton's internet freedom speech, and this entire meme that has been created and I think rightly replicated around the world about internet freedom. So this is a very important issue, and what this does is it's providing an opportunity for people to challenge that notion of internet freedom and to point out what they're calling hypocrisy. So that to me is a problem. It can also be an opportunity if it's addressed appropriately. Another issue is that individual citizens are living their life online to a much greater extent than they did 5 years ago even. It's really amazing if you think, I'll just give you an example I was talking about today. So 5 years ago, I would read the paper in the morning, and now I'm completely connected to my smartphone all the time, and I'm posting information, I'm communicating. So the public sphere is what's at stake here. The public sphere is online, and I think that is much greater than during these last instances a few years ago that were mentioned. So scale, the issue of people being more cognizant about how their internal private life is lived out in the digital realm, and also the meme that has been fairly successful about internet freedom has ensued in these intervening years.
I think those are brilliant points.
Yeah, I think.
Let me give Liv a chance, please.
I was just going to say quickly that technology makes lots of things possible, and it was clear at the time of those articles, it's clear today. It doesn't mean that it's eminently mineable, that that's done outside of due process. And I think those are the things that are getting people excitable. It's not technology, and it's not what's technically possible or even what's technically feasible. It's actually ultimately the full mining and then the lack of public scrutiny.
What about the argument that you hear from some people that not only are we 3 years farther away from 9/11, several of you made the point that a lot of these original processes were passed almost in a battlefield mentality, one of you used that phrase, and that there were extreme circumstances with the value of national security and protecting the homeland very much in the forefront of public debate. So you got 3 years later, but some people would argue there's almost a contradiction here. Certainly the intelligence community would say, well, actually, people are more relaxed now and less concerned about the threat because our systems have worked, and that you shouldn't be dismantling systems which have actually made people more secure.
That's
How would you
contrary
answer
to
that?
what the president has said, though. I mean, what the president has told us.
Although he has said he's in favor of this system.
Yes, and he said that the capability is necessary. He's in no way precluded additional oversight. I think he's actually welcomed a discussion of what kind of oversight we need. But he said we're living at a lower threat level, and that we need to make changes as a society and as a government in response to that. So not the other way around.
Edward Snowden, to some people he's a traitor. To some people he's a hero. What do you think?
Everybody under clearance, you sign a document that says if you disclose secrets, there's a penalty. So from that standpoint, he clearly violated that document, and I don't have a problem with him being prosecuted because of that. On the
Because
other
of
side,
his contractual obligation.
Because of the contractual thing. I mean, it states anybody who has a clearance, you have that, it's in the agreement, and it says clearly that you 25 years in prison or whatever it is. That
You actually read that?
It's there, yeah. happens when you come from a family of lawyers, you know. No, I mean, you look, yeah, I mean, if I'm gonna go to jail, I wanna know what I have to say, right? And so I think from that standpoint, yes. I think the rest of the community is still kind of divided as to whether or not the information that he's disclosed is a problem. And some people go back, kind of like what I was saying is, there've been articles about this for, you know, a long time. You know, we can go back into the 70s when NSA had the Echelon program, in the mid-90s with Omnivore and Carnivore. You know, all of those type of things. You've had this type of electronic surveillance for quite some time. So we're not quite sure what it is, and not having seen all that he's disclosed, but we're not quite sure what it is that he's telling the world that we don't know already. And so from that standpoint, I think part of my community, we're not sure about the content, but certainly he violated the agreement, and you know, that's what they're going to go after him for.
So I have mixed views about Snowden, because I think that whistleblowing in a free society and our right to know is critically important. And, you know, go back to the Pentagon Papers, and terrible things did not happen with the publishing of the Pentagon Papers.
I covered the Pentagon Papers story and covered Daniel Ellsberg's trial.
And Ellsberg's trial,
yes.
and Ellsberg is very, very out there right now about Snowden. I was kind of right with him until he started giving away the U.S. cybersecurity strategy with respect to China while he was in Hong Kong. And then I started to wonder exactly what his motivations were. You know, and so I do feel like there's a level of recklessness that worries me. And although it's hard for me to really know if there's damage to national security, because I've sat in some of these meetings with national security people who I've held up the minimization guidelines and said, is there anything in here that's really secret or should be? And they've said no. The existence of these programs, sort of in broad brush, some people knew. So if at the end of the day, it's that the public finally knows that it's happening, because I'm not sure that anything's been revealed that would allow people to somehow evade all of this, then I think, you know, society has to make room for whistleblowers. I just wish we had whistleblowers who were a little less reckless.
Well, you know, he, as a whistleblower, he appears to have delusions of grandeur. I mean,
Well,
on the
right.
first couple days, he made statements such as that he could order a wiretap of the president, and he could, you know, had all the locations of all the NSA stations. Pretty unlikely. That said, I guess you know, I think that his disclosures have done a public service. I think he's a whistleblower in that sense. I absolutely agree. It seems like he's broken the law. It doesn't seem very complicated. What I find confusing is that somehow the traditional notion of civil disobedience seems to have been lost track of in what he's doing. I mean, look, he's put his life at total risk, and
Well, the traditional idea is you pay the penalty for having
penalty,
broken
and
the law.
you have a trial, and you expose the things that you're concerned about, and you expose them further. Look, I mean, he's a civilian. He wouldn't be tried in a court martial the way Bradley Manning is. Right. He could have staged a public trial and a big public discussion, and he chose not to. And again, it's not for me to say how people should put their lives at risk as he does, but I think it's an incomplete act of civil disobedience.
Anybody else want to got a view on that? Let me ask you another question. One of the things that Dan said that I thought very interesting analysis when he talked about the internet not being a creature of the state, how earlier forms of communication, whether it's telephones and telegraph, and so many of them grew up, television spectrums, I mean, they were sold by the government, right? And still are. So there's an inherent regulatory, legal, organic connection between earlier forms of communication and government regulation, which, as you point out, is missing in a large part in this particular system we've all been talking about. But it's more than a legal question, it seems to me. It's also a cultural question. That a lot of you, being soaked in this culture and committed to this culture, have evinced skepticism of government and of regulation. And yet, at the same time, you're grappling with the notion of how do you bring some order to a system that continues to cry out for some kind of regulation. I'm interested for you to muse a little bit about the contradiction between sort of the historic origins and the culture of this system and the need to bring some order and regulation to it. It seems to me there's an inherent conflict that's worth talking about. Start.
I'll kick off the discussion about that. I think sometimes when you go to a workshop that discusses internet governance, it descends into a question such as who should grab the keys of internet governance, right? So the question of, so if a question were asked such as, should the United Nations control the internet, or should the United States control it, or should Google control it? Like, those kinds of questions don't make any sense in their first instance. And part of that is because there is no monolithic system of internet governance. It's highly granular, it's multi-layered. There are so many different levels of internet governance. I mean, my book is very long and I only get into some of them. But the issue here is multi-stakeholder governance and what that means. So internet governance is very interesting because it is not about governments necessarily, but that doesn't mean that there's not a role for government in many different areas. So if I have identity theft, I'd like the government to step in and help me. I expect antitrust enforcement. I expect some laws about privacy. I expect some laws about intellectual property rights enforcement. I expect certain national statutes on any variety of things related to trade, child protection. So there are many places for the government to be in internet regulation and governance, but most functions that are related to the operational stability and security of the internet have not been the purview of traditional governments, but they've been enacted by private industry, and I think that that's a very important point. Now, tying this back to the PRISM issue, one concern that I have is that the one separate area of how the internet is being used and the data that can be collected and gathered will bleed into this other area of the operational stability and security of the internet. So we can expect to see this issue used as a proxy for governments that are interested in gaining control in certain operational areas of the internet. I guarantee that that will happen. So we'll see that in some, we'll see calls for international treaties, again, that leave out private industry. That leave out civil society. We'll see it in additional calls for bringing in a more multilateral control of some critical internet resources. So I think one bleeds into another, but that it's really not about private industry versus governments or civil society versus private industry, for example. It's about the more contextual question of what governance is necessary for which particular area. So in certain cases, it's completely appropriate for only the private sector to be involved. In other cases, it's the purview of government. So it has to be asked in a contextual area, and that's what multi-stakeholder governance is. It's not everybody in charge of every granular area. That's not it. It's about what's the appropriate form of governance in a particular area.
John?
So the one thing we do know is that the internet evolves very quickly. I was involved in 25 years of it, and it changes rapidly. What was dial-up modems and just Telnet and FTP quickly became circuits and high-speed fiber. Yeah, okay, sorry, lots of acronyms. And the web.
My work here is done. Yeah.
The fact is that evolution doesn't work well with government regulation. Having been involved in the telecommunications side of the industry, as opposed to the internet side, I also dealt with a lot of government regulations. And generally, we were dealing with regulations that were 3 to 10 years behind the time, trying to drag them into current circumstances. And it was inevitable. The process of regulation doesn't work well with a forward-looking, rapidly evolving internet. So, when we start thinking about the non-governmental nature of the internet, as the internet grows up, we find ourselves in a conundrum because the internet is no longer optional. The internet is entwined in everyone's life. Governments are looking at their economies and going, some percentage of my economy is tied to this. You can say I have a choice as to whether or not I'm going to participate, but I don't. I have to be involved. So governments are now realizing they have no choice. They need to be involved. They look at their duties, their responsibilities, and they go, how do I affect what I'm required to do in this new media? And it's a big challenge, folks, because the protocols and the operational conventions that hold the internet together have to be global. They have to interoperate on a global basis. But governments are used to acting on a national basis, occasionally regional, occasionally bilateral, multilateral, but generally they act on a national basis. And you can easily break the internet by attempting to regulate it without the idea of a global context in which it operates in. This is really what's been opened up in the last 5 years. In the last 5 years, governments are realizing they do need to get involved. They don't understand the framework by which they can do so safely. In general, this has resulted to not much regulation, but that's not necessarily going to be the case going forward. And it's the internet community, and I say that being the operators, the various entities that operate pieces of the infrastructure, aren't exactly forthcoming to governments saying, here, this is how to safely regulate the internet. That guidebook has not been written. And so without a meeting of the minds on this topic, we run the risk that governments are going to make regulations that make no sense or break portions of the internet. Until there's an understood common framework for this, we are all at risk.
Lynn, you wanted to talk?
Yeah, I mean, very good comments both from Laura and John. And I just want to make sure that we're not left with a myth here that much of the internet community believes that there's no role for governments. We've been engaging with governments, and certainly we could have done it better over the years. But you know, for many, many years, when ISOC had a very small staff of 7 people, I was going to WSIS prep comms and spending weeks, because you don't go to United Nations meeting for 2 days, you go for 2 and 3 weeks. That's a significant investment, and we went because we wanted people to understand how the internet actually worked. I take a slight disagreement with John, and nobody has the answer about how we regulate for a lot of these new environments. It's not because we think there should be no regulation, it's because we can't figure out what sort of regulation there should be. And to John's other point, it is because of the pace with which the internet changes. And it is the fact that it's broken so many global boundaries. You can't do it within any single context. So it is a very, very complex world. And we continue to advocate for dialogue, discussion, thoughtful, let it take the time it needs. We need to pull apart lots of different complexities and let the right thing emerge. That is not the same as saying no role for governments, but it often gets
And another dimension of this is not all governments are the same. Because you can talk about China being a pretty malign force in terms of internet freedom, to say nothing of Iran, which uses the internet to roll up all networks of dissent. Where in Tahrir Square, the internet is a mechanism for expression. So part of it, part of the problem is government, even as a concept, is subject to many different definitions. Yeah.
It is, Steve, but that's probably why the Western governments that operate in democracies with legal and constitutional frameworks, that it's particularly important. And one of the reasons people are particularly unhappy about this particular surveillance is if we're trying to come up with this nuanced role about where government belongs, we haven't exactly sent the right message to the rest of the world. And I think that's part of the problem here.
I just want to offer a kind of a friendly amendment, I hope, to John's view. You know, I think John correctly points out that attempting to regulate the internet infrastructure, whether it's the institutions that operate and design it or the actual operators, is very dicey because it changes very quickly and it has to work on a global basis. That was the experience of SOPA, of the Stop Online Privacy Act, was that policymakers thought they could reach in. Piracy Act.
FISA is the stop.
That's right. Thank you. Right. You know, governments thought they could reach in to the internet infrastructure to solve a problem that is really about human behavior and violating laws. However, at the same time, there are plenty of legal rules that actually work incredibly well on the internet. You know, the FTC is still using the Fair Credit Reporting Act from 1970, which was one of our first privacy laws in the United States, to stop very advanced, sophisticated online services from harming people. That's not causing John any problems. He doesn't even have to think about it. And so I think there's, I think that it's when governments try to do the sort of shortcuts that they were used to doing, as you were suggesting with the broadcasters, you know, say, you guys have to behave this way in order for us to achieve a broader policy goal. That's where we really have problems in the internet environment.
You know, a number of you have used the word privacy as a value and as a very cherished value. But I want you to play with the idea that perhaps we're actually really ambivalent about the question of privacy, because in fact, in many ways, the wide availability of data is actually an enormous convenience. Every time you go to a website and you put in your email address, and up comes your password and all your credit card information, and it one-stop shopping at Amazon, right? We all love it, but isn't that?
But we made a decision to share that with them.
Well, wait just a minute. I understand that, but I want to pose the question about whether, at some point, aren't we really ambivalent about this question, that we actually like people to have information about it when it serves our purposes of convenience and accessibility, and that there is a certain, I understand your point about voluntary, but there's a larger point here as well.
I think part of the problem is the public is realizing that the people that are storing the information that we give to them aren't doing a good job of protecting it. I could go to my local bank. I grew up in Falls Church. I used to go to the local First Virginia Bank right there in Falls Church. I gave them all my information when I opened up my first account when I was a teenager. And I had a reasonable expectation that the only way they were going to get that, anybody else was going to get that information, was if they actually went in and robbed the bank and stole the file, you know, the file cabinet or whatever.
Or if anyone in the government wanted it.
Or if anyone in the government wanted it. I mean, you know, that's the reasonable thing. But nowadays, when we find out that you have all these massive data leaks, you know, and when you examine the root cause of what the leak was from a technical standpoint, that should have been fixed 15 years ago. You know, some of these attacks, I do a talk now. They asked me, you know, I guess they said because I got gray hair and I've been in the security business for 20 years, they think I know something, but I do a talk said that contrast.
It's because of the ponytail.
I think it is. You know, it's the same attack methods that we saw in the early 90s are still effective in 2013. And so my question to the technical community was, what have we been doing these last 20 years? I mean, you know, I in the SANS Institute that I was part of, we drew up a top 10 threats in 2001. I pulled it out, and today in 2013, every single one of those top 10 threats from 2001 is still effective today. So what have we been doing to protect ourselves? And I think it's that type of thing that's causing this rumble about, you know, well, private industry isn't doing anything about it, individuals aren't doing anything about it, so that only leaves a government to do something about it. You know, and so I think that's why we're seeing that push in that direction. Because historically, when you look at it, the same things are still affecting us. It's just that what's happening now is back in 2001, the scope of a data breach was much less than the scope of a data breach now.
Sure.
And just one last aside, the iPhone, I think I looked it up, is 5 years old today, this year. So to answer your question about why the difference from...
hold on just a second, John, because Leslie, there's a point you wanted to make about the voluntary submission of data.
I don't think so. I think every point has been made by everybody quite well.
Okay, John?
You say that maybe people don't value privacy over convenience, and that we give up privacy and there's no outrage about that. Why is there an outrage in some cases? And I guess the question that comes up is, a lot of people voluntarily give up privacy because we want the convenience. We want to click the button and get the order done. We want the website to know who we are. We want to fill out all the information on the airline profile because it just makes traveling a little easier, and anything that makes it easier.
And who
is
can
worth it.
remember all those damn passwords
Right.
anyway, right?
So there are times we do that. But the reality is that there's also times when you consent to losing your privacy in situations that aren't for your convenience, but you're going to anyway. Next time you go into your doctor, pick up that HIPAA form and look at it. Okay? It says, we're going to share your data with the CDC because if there's an outbreak of something, we're going to do that. Okay? It's not for my convenience. Hopefully I'm not relevant. But the fact is, they're going to do it. And we consent to it because, well, we knew about it. We understand
And there's a
reason.
public interest involved.
There's a
because-
public interest, but also, as annoying as that form is, they took the time to tell us. I do think that's a different question when there's surveillance going on and you don't know about it at all. And I think that might be the angst behind a lot of this.
Leslie?
Well, I also think that there's difference between surveillance by the government and surveillance by companies. Now, I mean, I think they've become more joined together because they are now the source of all the information that the government's collecting. But I think, at least in a constitutional system, not in Europe where they make no distinction, having the government who has the capacity to impose penalties on people and make choices about who is going to be prosecuted, et cetera, is an entirely different matter than whether I like or dislike that, Google profiles keep sending me the same crib for my pregnant daughter over and over again. I'm annoyed. I'm extremely annoyed. But I also think
They knew she was pregnant before she did.
well, they probably did.
Right.
They knew that I looked at this thing once, and it's following me. It's literally following me around the world. I mean, it's become kind of a joke. But I find that annoying, and I'm somebody who knows how to set my privacy settings. So, in one circumstance, it's a loss of some measure of control. We ought to have more control. It's one of the reasons we ought to have a baseline bill to give us some fair information practices. And the other, the government has the capacity to make very important decisions about us. And we have a constitution that says they have to follow rules. And so we do react differently to the crib and to the NSA.
Yeah.
The one thing I would say about our tension between convenience and privacy is, I just think I think privacy has always been a kind of a contested concept. I mean, it's not an absolute. I don't think there's anyone hardly in the world who thinks it's an absolute condition. But we, as Leslie's saying, we have different privacy expectations. We want different privacy results at different times, and some of the privacy problems that we have are nuisances, like seeing the same crib too many times. Others have real consequence. Like if your credit report is wrong and you can't get a mortgage, you're really, it really hurt. You don't get a job. It really makes a big difference. And I think that. I think in a way I think categorizing privacy as a single right is what makes the conversation a little confused, because the reality is it's a number of concerns wrapped up into one.
But in this day and age, isn't it a little naive to say, I'm going to give my information to Amazon, or I'm going to give my information to Google for my own purposes because I choose to, and somehow I'm going to be able to control
yes.
all the use of that information?
Yeah, that's not doable, and I don't think any privacy law we would pass in this country would change that.
It is naive, but I think the problem is I don't mind giving you any information you ask me about me if you tell me ahead of time what you're going to do with that information. So what John was talking about in the HIPAA thing, when they say we're going to give it out to the CDC, and you tell me ahead of time, before I give you that information, that's a much different environment than giving it here and then buried, in the fine print is a little click thing that says, oh, by the way, we're going to give this to anybody we want.
We only have a few more minutes, and I want to, you've mentioned, a number of you, the fact that we're dealing with a very complex system, as Laura said, with a lot of stakeholders here. And one of the stakeholders are these providers, whether it's Google, whether it's Yahoo, who take that information, They don't warn you in some ways that they're going to give it away because they're not voluntarily giving it away. They're being subpoenaed. They're being ordered to by the government. And they are caught. We have these institutions, these huge institutions. They're private institutions. But as we've learned through PRISM and all the revelations, subject to government orders and government warrants. And many of them are fighting this, at least fighting to be able to be more transparent because they have their stakeholders too. And they're worried that their brands are going to be tarnished by being swept up in this. And talk a little bit about the special role of these institutions, these intermediary institutions, the Apples, the Microsofts, the Googles, who are on one hand are getting pulled by the government to release the information, and the other hand are being pressured to keep it private. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really important question. And if you look at, let me just back it up to before PRISM. If you look at even just the Google transparency reports, which probably don't have everything in it, and even Google says that national security isn't, not everything is reflected in the transparency reports, but when you do look at something like that, you can see that there is a very big disconnect between what governments are asking information intermediaries to do and what they actually do. So you can see that just to give an example, maybe they disclose data about an individual in 37% of the time in to the Brazilian government, or 47% of the time to another government. You see what I'm saying? There is a disconnect, and that differential between the request to turn over user data and the actual instances of turning over the data, that's where they have this special governance role, and that's an important point to make. But they also bear a burden in carrying out requests, such as the more recent revelations, because there's a public relations hit. There is the cost of hiring numerous attorneys to deal with the fallout from this, and there's the possible economic impact of having trouble doing business in other parts of the world that might be suspicious towards those companies.
You might be thanking, they might be thanking Snowden for the revelations because, and of course, by the national security letters, they can't tell. They're not allowed to let anyone know that they collected the data. So now, on the other hand, you have the Snowden revelations, which are saying, hey, these guys had to give out the data, so, you know, and now that's come out. What they should have said is, instead of trying to backpedal a little bit and saying, oh, you know, trying to save their reputation, we said, look, you got subpoenaed. We know you got subpoenaed. You gave up the data because it's the law. But I think that piece of it is the secrecy, not being able to say why something was collected, you know, and not being able to even say anything about it.
Leslie?
Well, I mean, the question raises this bigger question when we talk about players in the internet ecosystem. The intermediaries are a critical part, and we have, under our law, we sort of provide them with a lot of special protections because they can't be liable for everything that's going on their platforms, and yet they're under enormous pressure. This national security revelation is one small piece of this very complex environment where, when you ask about governments and governments trying to regulate, the first place that governments go in trying to solve anything, a social problem, is to try to figure out how to get the intermediaries to take on that responsibility. Mm-hmm. So this has been sort of a tension that's existed since we actually had any kind of powerful intermediaries. So that's one side. And the other side is the amount of power they have as a governance entity to set the rules of the road for the internet.
And one of the interesting variables here is I noticed just recently that several of the big players, Microsoft, Google, Yahoo, I think 3, have all filed suit. Right. In an attempt to be able to be more transparent about the role and the requirements they're under. I think in part because of the point Laura was raising, that they themselves, given the culture that they're part of and the stakeholders they have, they're taking a big public relations and branding hit for this kind of cooperation.
And they also have real leverage here, which they have exercised on occasion. Right. You know, many of the big intermediaries, Google, Twitter, others, have at times gone to court to challenge subpoenas and other kinds of court orders they receive, saying that they're too broad. I mean, Google had been under order to turn over large volumes of search log data. This was just in criminal cases, not national security
Right.
cases. And they've challenged those, and they, so the intermediaries have a really important role because at least until there's a change in the law, they are often the only ones who can actually bring any kind of challenge to the scope of the authority that the government is claiming.
But this is nothing new, because in World War II, the federal government used to look at the telegraphs at RCA and look at the phone system for records and stuff like that. I mean, what's changed is the number of players, because back then it was just those two, I suppose, plus maybe some minors. Now you have, multinational groups all over the place. But the technique, the tactic of government going to a provider and getting the information they need, it's historical. It's been there.
I would assume the Egyptian government did that when the communications were chiseled, letters chiseled on stone tablets. We have 5 minutes left. I'm gonna give each of you 1 minute we've had a long day, very attentive audience, a lot of issues. But I want to give each of you a chance to make a final point after this conversation. You started with your initial remarks, but what do you want the audience to be left with? What in each of your minds is something significant we've talked about today, an issue that you want to reinforce? I want to give each of you a chance to do that. And since we started with you earlier, I'll start with you this way and we'll go down.
So as contentious as this process is, I think it's incredibly important, the dialogue that's happening in the United States. Hopefully we can do more than just have battles in the newspapers and on panels like this, and really look at our legal system and make sure that it has the kind of accountability that we need. Laura said, the problem here is scale, and I really agree with that. Courts have been good at supervising electronic surveillance when it's one wiretap on one phone number or a handful of phone numbers. The scale of intrusion here is such that we can only manage it and have a proper oversight with using exactly the same kind of computational tools and analytic tools that are being used by the intelligence agencies to try to mine this data to begin with. And the one other thing I would just say is, this is, as several people have said, this is a global discussion. The U.S. is obviously an important part of the internet environment, but we are not the only country on the internet, and we do not control the whole internet. And I think that just as we are examining the behavior of our intelligence agencies, I think it's very important that other countries that have democratic values, that believe in transparency and due process, really look very hard at their intelligence and surveillance practices as well.
Thanks, Dan. Lynn?
I guess I'd start with saying that everybody's voice is extraordinarily important, not only here in the U.S., but every individual around the world, and we need attention and we need voice to every issue, whether it's this particular set of issues or it's the United Nations expressed interest in some portions of the internet ecosystem. And I think specific to this issue, the only thing I would say is that, as I said earlier, we're all very interconnected and very interdependent. And when we think about things such as security or managing risk or trying to manage those trade-offs, we actually need to do that with both sides of the dialogue. One, actually looking at what we can actually do to protect and ensure things that support economic prosperity and social development, while trading off against preventing any perceived harm. I think we're much too far over on the side of preventing perceived harm, and that we don't quite have the balance right yet.
Laura?
I think it's important not to take the stability and success and the security of the internet for granted. So we're used to it working for the most part because of efforts like John's organization and others, and it is working, but we also have examples of problems with denial of service attacks, examples of governments cutting off access, examples of interconnection problems. We have trends away from interoperability, which I think is a really big problem. We have trends away from anonymity, which changes the nature of the technical infrastructure. So point one is that we cannot take the stability and security for granted. It has required a tremendous amount of effort on the parts of many, many people, and it's something that that concerns me every day when I see some of the trends away from interoperability and security and interconnection security, basically. So that's point number one. The second point is, if we believe that we have the public sphere in the online environment, if we believe that there's the technical mediation of the public sphere, then we have to think about what that means. What does a democracy look like when the public sphere is now digital? So we know historically that possibilities for anonymity, or at least traceable anonymity, have been closely linked to democracy. So I think it's important to just ask the question of what does democracy look like when we have this technical mediation of the public sphere and the privatization of conditions of civil liberties, where private companies are getting requests delegated from governments or carrying out their own governance of these infrastructures. So don't take the internet security and stability for granted. Remember that we have the technical mediation of the public sphere and the privatization of conditions of civil liberties. And the final point is that internet governance is something that is that the public can be engaged in. We've seen examples of civil society action, of private action, civil liberties advocates involved in decisions about internet governance. There are many avenues to do that. I do have an engineering background, but the technology is not that hard, that people can learn the technology, learn the issues, and get engaged in these debates, which are very important, because as goes internet governance, so goes internet freedom.
Randy?
All of you here that are attending this panel discussion, you all have a stake in what we've been talking about. And so I would challenge you guys to not only make sure that your peers understand what some of the pressures are and what some of the pitfalls and what some of the advantages are of working with the internet, but also you guys are probably going to be on a track where you're going to be working with legislators and policymakers and things like that, and make sure that they understand the implications of whatever it is that they're trying to write up or implement, both on the legal side and on the policy side. That's to me what I see your contribution to the whole thing. It's going to be very incremental. It's going to take a long time. You know, some people talk about the fact that it's like when the automobile was first introduced at the turn of the century, and it took us 25 years to come up with a set of laws and procedures to make things work, but we didn't do that. But you guys are the ones that are going to be talking to and down the road influencing policy and laws. And so, you know, take the challenge, do it, and influence what you can.
Leslie?
So I'm just going to make one point, and that's that those of us who are Americans or people in the United States have a voice in this debate that we need to exercise, but we need to exercise it with more than our own rights in mind. I mean, if the interesting thing about the internet and the lack of a government control is that it's also very unclear about who's responsible for the human rights of people in the online environment. And I think the NSA example that we have data flowing all over the world, states have obligations to people within their borders and a few other kinds of places that the law has developed. We're not sure who has the obligation for the rights of internet users in this kind of an environment. And it's a conversation that really needs to happen, because our lives, some significant part of who we are is now online and flowing through these wires, and who ultimately is responsible to make sure that basic privacy and free expression rights are honored has become increasingly complex. So people need to take that on as well.
Last word, John.
It's a global internet. There needs to be an equally global discussion about the principles by which we operate it. And part of what's occurred over the last few months will help encourage one aspect of that discussion. So it's probably a good thing.
I want to thank all of you for being here. I want to thank the Internet Society. I want to thank the GW Engineering Department and their Lance Hoffman's Institute. Long afternoon. Thanks for your patience. I hope you learned something. Come back again. Thanks a lot.
And thank you, Steve. That was just a fantastic job. Thanks to the panelists. Hey, I want to invite you all to a reception that's just down the hall. I do hope you will join us. So as you go out the door, just turn left, and there's a reception a couple doors down. Thank you.